And I'd like to welcome Commissioner McCoy in place of Commissioner Butt, who is unable to be with us this evening. And I assume we're expecting Commissioner Durant?
Yes.
Okay. With that, if you would all rise, and maybe Mr. Barr would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So the first item on our agenda is public comment. This is an opportunity for people to comment on items that are not on tonight's agenda but are within our purview. We will welcome public comment on each agenda item as we go through them. At this point, I have no request to make a comment during public comment. Is there anyone who would like to do so? All right, seeing none, that brings us down to the approval of the minutes from our meeting of March 9th.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion by Commissioner Pierce, second by Commissioner Romick. Any other comments?
Commissioner Abelson brought out a point to me, and I didn't even catch it, but it lists Supervisor Glover as an ex officio member. And,
oops.
Oops. He's a real deal guy.
Yeah.
So thank you for catching
We
it.
apologize.
He's a real deal guy. So.
Yeah, he is. All right.
He counts.
So I assume the motion included making that change. All right. All right. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? And Commissioner Durant is still absent. Which brings us now to our regular agenda item, which is the review of the updated draft initial transportation expenditure plan. And Mr. Chittenden.
Thank you, Chair Tatson. So this agenda largely consists of one item, and it's an action item. We've listed all the agenda items up to today's meeting as throughout all the special TEP meetings as information items, and that was really to allow you to provide us directions and deliberate and reconsider things as we go. Today we have an action item, and I would like to point out, have Bill Gray of Gray Bowen Scott is sitting at the table up here, and he and I think Eric Zell may be joining him as well. We're going to do a little tag teaming when we get into the discussion part of this after I do an introduction. So your packet includes our latest, what we're still calling our initial draft TEP, and one of the things we want to say about that, we're calling it this initial draft because this still largely is a product of staff consultant team with a lot of input, and we'll talk about all the input, or we've been talking about all the input we've received over the last about a year now. And the intent here is that we remove that initial draft tonight and call it the draft TEP. And the significance of that is that this kind of transfers from staff consultant product to be your product. This is, again, something that we want you to be able to discuss with your colleagues at the cities and the RTPCs, knowing that it's still a draft, but that you've had input into this beyond just the input that we've received from public and RTPCs, EPAC, and others. So this is really where it kind of transfers from staff consultant into being your product. I'm going to be referring to quite a few handouts as we go through the presentation here. So the handout packet on your DS, actually on the second page, we list all the items. So I wanted to list them, and there's a few that are more significant than others. They're all significant. The first four items, and they're packaged in the order that they're listed here, are the latest letters, comment letters that we've received from the various RTPCs. A couple of these you've seen already, Transplan and Transpac. Those were handouts at the March 16th meeting. WCTAC met Friday and sent us a letter, and SWAT met yesterday and sent us a letter. So those are brand new. And I just wanted to have those for reference, and I'll point out a couple of things as I get into more detail later in my presentation. At one of our recent meetings, you asked Mala, Best and Krieger to provide an opinion on the ability for a new transportation expenditure plan or new ordinance that would be associated with that to, if it has the ability to amend an existing ordinance, the Measure J, and we have that response, and the short answer is yes, it can, but it's not something that's necessary if we want to keep things separate. So something we'll be talking about some more, and if you have any questions, Molly can address those. And then I have a draft memorandum that I want to send out if we wrap up this process here tonight to solicit the input from our TPCs, cities, towns, and the county through the PMA and other interested stakeholders. There's some correspondence items as well, but these first 6 or so there are associated with this item. So the specifically staff is seeking board's approval to circulate this new draft TEP, your draft. We've been using this numbering convention. This would be draft TEP 3.0 to EPAC, our TPCs, cities, towns, and the county, and other interested parties for additional review and comment. And we would like to do that as soon as possible. And again, reviewing the schedule real quick. We do have a special meeting on the books for next Wednesday if necessary. If we're successful tonight, that may not be necessary. So I'm going to work very hard that we have a successful meeting, and hopefully everyone else is committed to do that as well. Then we'd regroup at our on the same date as our regular board meeting on April 20th. I think we'd still call it a special meeting focused on the TEP, and staff and consultants can report on activities that occur between now and then. And then we really regroup in May. We have 3 special meetings scheduled for May, the first 3 Wednesdays of May, and that's where we would take this initial draft and all the input of various suggestions, comments, negotiations that would occur throughout the month of April. I didn't bring it with me, but I think you all recall the schedule diagram that I've shown a couple of times where we have this schedule in 3 phases. So again, if we're successful tonight, we're wrapping up that first phase, which is to develop the draft TEP, and then move into the next phase, which would be to review that draft, get comments, and by May 16th, I believe it is our regular board meeting, we would have the final TEP, which is the version that we would circulate to the cities and cities, towns, and the county for adoption by the councils and the Board of Supervisors. So this month of April is really critical. And again, we're wrapping up one phase, but we're beginning another. So we're not at the end. And with that, that's why we're still keeping the word draft. We know it's not done. Several outstanding items, and again, I'll try to highlight those as I go through my presentation. And as we discussed last week, we know that the board may wish to provide some direction tonight for revision. So that's part of the discussion that we'll have tonight. Again, the desire is that we can that you accept the draft that's in the packet and identify those critical items that you want us to change before we release it. I would kind of caution, we really don't expect or really want a lot of wordsmithing at this point in time. We really want to make it focused on content and intent. One of the things you'll see as we review the draft memo that I have out here, we've identified that another activity that will be occurring in April is we'll take the draft and put it in the hands of our communication consultant and ask them to turn it into a little more public-friendly language. So that's something we need to be very careful with. We know that the draft has a lot of jargons. There's probably 20 or more and/ors, which probably are kind of language that we may not want in the final version. So we'd like to get it to our communication consultants and then get it back and make sure that they maintain the integrity of the content and the intent of what's in there. But we know that we really need to make it a little more public friendly before we take it to the ballot. So that'll be happening concurrently with the review and ongoing discussion with stakeholders. I know you're all aware that we have an EPAC meeting scheduled for next week, Thursday, April 7th. That again, if we release the draft tonight, we'll review with them. And we know that we have a continuing effort from some of the key folks in the EPAC who have been meeting for the last 4 or 5, maybe 6 weeks, trying to negotiate some significant points. And at some point in time, we hope that we'll hear from them and have some specific recommendations on all aspects of the TEP or certain key elements that are of a big interest to that group. So with that, I'd like to just review some of the materials that are in front of you, and then we can get into the discussion. The first comment letter, new, is from WICTAC. Several points in there, making some reallocations of funds. One item that I would like to point out is that a proposed change would result in a return to source at about 13% for the communities in West County, and as staff and consultants, that's a concern to us and something we may want to talk about. We need to remind ourselves we need to go through all the city councils and board of supervisors before we can even think about going to the ballot. So we need to ask ourselves if all the jurisdictions over there can still support a measure that has that level of return to source funding. So again, SWAT met yesterday. Their letter has a number of comments. Some of the comments are specific to funding categories that are solely in the SWAT area, and we'll be able to review those probably fairly readily. Other ones are making suggestions to some regional or county-wide categories, and those will need to work with throughout the county with the other RTPCs to find out if there is consensus amongst the RTPCs for all of those suggestions. Transplant and Transpac, again, we looked at those letters on March 16th. I think they're fairly straightforward, and most, if not all, of the comments have been addressed. I'd like to quickly walk through the staff report to identify the areas that significant changes that occurred between the last version and this version. They're starting on page 2 of your staff report. The preface was revised, consolidated, condensed based on direction from the authority board on March 16th. The result is largely and almost identical to the goals that were adopted when we started this process way back when with the countywide transportation plan. So we've been consistent with that for about 3 years or so. Table of allocation, a table of expenditure plan allocations. A lot of numbers were moved around, primarily moving funds from what was in the former regional choice category to reflect sub-regional priorities. You'll also notice in this version, and we can provide a larger print if needed, we, in addition to showing the countywide breakout of allocations, we do have the subdivision down to the subregions within the county, and I do see that as pretty small. So Hisham has distributed larger versions to staff, and we can provide larger, more easy to read versions to you as well. A number of changes to some of the descriptions in the funding categories. Local streets, maintenance and improvements. I know we've edited some of the language that was in Measure J to declare an intent that this additional funding is to be used for infrastructure. If we are using Measure J return to source dollars for other planning activities or other kinds of operations, we think that that can continue. Funding's there for that, and this funding should be used for infrastructure. That was the argument all along from the public works folks, city managers, and certainly as staff. We agree that there's a need for a large amount of funding for infrastructure. The major streets, complete streets, traffic signal synchronization program, the language there was revised to reflect the intent of the complete streets policy, the discussion that we had at our last meeting. Category 3 BART capacity, access and parking improvements. When I get to my list of outstanding items, this will be one on that list. We continue to have discussions with BART management and some of the BART board of directors, and I know we're all committed to finding some mutually agreeable language that reflects the intent that we help BART meet their needs of expanding their vehicle fleet. And I think we'll continue to work on that language and have something within the next couple of weeks, hopefully before we get together in mid-April. Category 5, the I-80 corridor, some significant changes there to reflect some priorities that were communicated by WICTAC, primarily to reflect out some infrastructure improvements separately from the transit improvements that are being studied on the high-capacity transit project underway over there. 680 Highway 4 242. We put in some language that it needs to be reviewed. It's talking about the need for projects to be contiguous or immediately located next to these corridors. That was put in for a purpose so that we don't have a lot of scope creep, that projects that don't really address congestion on those corridors may get funded out of these buckets. And we can continue to work with staff on any concerns about that language. I think everyone agrees to the intent of the language. We just need to find the right language so that everyone's comfortable with what we said. Category 10, the East County corridors, Vasco, Byron Highway. This has been revised fairly significantly based on the large amount of testimony that we've had in the last couple of meetings and working with county public works and other staff. The overall TriLink project, as is still very conceptual scope and estimates, overall that'd be about $1 billion project, and those projects take a long time to plan and deliver. So we've listened to the needs of the folks out there and put in language to prioritize that these funds would be used for some early action construction, initially addressed at safety and getting trucks out of Byron, off Camino Diablo out there. So I think that's language that is acceptable to county staff, and maybe we'll hear from some folks tonight, and hopefully we can get consensus on that project. Category 12, bus and non-transit, non-rail transit enhancements. We've added a suggestion that came up from Commissioner Arnerich last week about trying to fill buses by offsetting fares, and that seems to be something that's popular with a couple of the operators. Transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. The intent of the program as originally written has not changed, but the description was rewritten just to be consistent with other categories, and this is a good example where we had multiple authors that just had different writing styles. So now the styles are fairly consistent. Community Development Transportation Program, new name. This will likely be a continuing outstanding item through April. Again, the intent of the program is to find a way to see if we can use this program, the expenditure plan program, to incentivize infill. There's been a number of ideas discussed, so this is one of the ideas, and we'll continue to see if this item or an alternative item can be found that would do that. Growth management program, the GMP that's in this version is identical to Measure J with the exception of the sections that refer to the urban limit line. We do have a number of comments in there. Those comments have been reflected through all of the draft versions to reflect some of the things that staff and the consultants have heard from the stakeholders. This is an item that I know there's a number of ideas for change. There's no consensus around it. Certainly one of the significant items that's being discussed without consensus yet is how we would address agricultural protection and mitigation, if that's appropriate for a growth management program. So I think we may have a little discussion on that tonight, and then I do believe that's another one that will continue throughout April. The urban limit line is a complete rework. It's to reflect staff and consultants' understanding of the discussion that occurred a couple of weeks ago. The significant point there is we all have an urban limit line, so we don't need to talk about how we form an urban limit line. We have one, so we really need to talk about how the need to continuously adhere to that as a condition to get return to source dollars and the conditions for amendment. So that's one where if that does not reflect the consensus of the board, that is one where we definitely would like feedback here tonight so that we get that corrected before we send that out. Complete streets policy, that is essentially what we reviewed last week with Matt and Dave. Advanced mitigation program, I put in a note there to talk about the fact that the program has widespread support, just very slow getting the effort underway. So we'll have to keep watching that and find the right language. I think we're all committed to the program. We just need to find the right protections for all parties so that we can make it work. Governing structure and implementing guidelines, the governing structure really hasn't been amended, a few tweaks in there, but we did note that staff and consultants have an action item to look at different options for membership. Again, if one of the comments or some of the comments we'd like back today is if there are significant changes needed towards the authority or the scope of that committee, we're open to that. I think we heard relative consensus to that, but again, if that's not true, we'd like to know that. Implementing guidelines, we did get some comments primarily from Commissioner Durant, and we hope that the changes in there were reflective of his comments. So that's a quick review of the TEP. I would like you, if you have it available, to pull out the draft memo for that would be used to transmit the memo or transmit the draft TEP for review. First page is the necessary history and some documentation of public input. So we've all seen that several times. Hopefully that works well. We discussed the fact that we've been meeting for the past year or so quite intensely. I'm sorry? It's a handout, I'm sorry. It says, big bold letters, draft for discussion at March 29th authority meeting, memorandum. 1.1-6. Yeah, no, okay. That doesn't have that. Yeah, at the bottom it says agenda item 1.1-6. So thank you. I want to make sure everyone sees this because I know this is something you did not get a chance to review in advance. So again, about half of the memo is really recounting history and talking about our public input process, meeting over the last year or so, soliciting input from RTPCs, other stakeholders. And then as we present the draft TEP, I think a couple of points that we want to letter to say. One is that the allocations that are in the draft TEP really largely reflect the input that we received from the RTPCs way back in August. We did make a few adjustments, primarily to provide additional funding for BART and for the new proposed community development transportation program. So by and large, what's shown in there is proportional to the RTPC request. Obviously, one of the big items was the return to source, and as we all know, we settled in on about 23% for that. And again, we'll want to have continuing discussions in West County to see if that or a different number is an appropriate number. So again, by and large, we're trying to have this bottoms-up process that really reflects the priorities of the RTPCs. And then we get into discussion about the policy considerations that have really dominated our meetings last fall and into the spring here, or winter. I guess we're now into the spring. And Terry Ann, if you can pull up that list, this is where we list the half a dozen or so items that we think are still significant that are unlikely, at least in my judgment, to be resolved tonight and will carry forward into April as we go through our review. And again, I've touched on a few of these already. First listed here is a fair and equitable regional strategy to assist BART in expanding its rail car fleet. So that really has two aspects, a regional strategy that involves the other counties that are members of BART, as well as some internal equity between the RTPCs. The split that's shown on the draft TEP to the RTPCs is based on population at this point in time, and there's been some suggestions for other methods, so that could be reviewed. And this is one I think Bill might want to chat a little bit about this, the second bullet, and this is just some internal discussions that we've had at staff and consultant, and don't know that there's any real red flag issues, but we want to take a hard look at the balance of the programs. Or do we have a program that holds together coherently from a voter perspective when we consider the priorities that they've identified to us? Is it a program that can be administered fairly? So, Bill, I don't know if you want to jump in and just...
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I've been involved in a number of these, and I know, first and foremost, that regional equity is a cornerstone in terms of what this authority was a part of a Measure C and Measure J, and it's been continued. And that's fine. But what I want to comment on is when I look at the plan now, on the regional, and first of all, I think there's a solution to this, so don't react negatively. I think the issue here is that as Ross said, you want a plan that can be administered over 25, 30 years, that it's fair and equitable. What we have today in a lot of these priorities is the snapshot of 2016 priorities on a countywide basis. I'm thinking of the programs in particular. And I think the goal at the end of the day ought to be that all of your programs ought to be laid out like they were in C and like they were in J, for the most part, on a percentage, or allocated to the subregions on a proportional basis based on population, and that number could be rolling. You could direct that we do that. But so I think the idea here is that, or my strong recommendation is, as we leave tonight, not asking you to try to fix this tonight, but direct Ross and I to spend some time with the various regional committees to find ways to give each one of them what they're asking for in terms of dollars vis-a-vis some of these programs. Particularly Major Streets is a good example of that, is to find ways that at the end of the day, I think your authority ought to have the core programs, Major Streets and Roads. You already do that with Return to Source. The bike program ought to be based on a pro rata population basis that you can administer. So the challenge is, between now and May, is for us to work with the regional committees to find ways to fund what they want, and they've said they wanted to fund, and there are priority projects locally, because that again is a cornerstone of this measure, or of this authority, is to provide local input, local priority setting. I think there's a way to do that. We've talked about leveraging some of the projects. There's a lot of money for one particular project over another. This authority has been really, really good at leveraging, and particularly on capital projects. I think an assumption of 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 leveraging is an appropriate thing to do. It doesn't take away, it makes the project a priority, but it doesn't require you totally fund it with measured dollars. And the same thing, we may propose or suggest some extension, a 30-year measure instead of a 25-year measure at the end of the day. That provides some more capital. One of our biggest challenges, and a good example of that, is the 680 corridor. We have a lot of input from the public that it's a priority and all that, and the only really way to deal with that is to make the pie a little bit bigger. And we've talked a lot internally about that, and I think in the May timeframe, and what I'm really saying is that we'd like the direction for basically staff and the consultant team to work with the regional committees with these issues in mind, and try to craft a plan that provides you and the staff ultimately with a regional equity formula that can be relatively easily administered. In other words, every year you test in terms of population balance, you look at the allocation of dollars, and then within that, the locals can then set the priorities. So I think that's clear, but I know it's going to be easier to show you and later, and we're not asking you to try to solve it today, but that's an issue.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I'm just about ready to wrap up here. So, just going through the list here, I've already talked about the Measure J Growth Management Program. Again, that's really dominated, or probably been the majority of the time. Time devoted in these special meetings to that topic, and I'm sure that there will continue to be some suggestions for some minor or maybe significant changes to that. Again, we haven't seen anything, and we'll have to continue to listen for that. I talked a little bit about the Oversight Committee. Staff and consultants will work on that. Another item, it's both in some of the funding categories as well as in the implementing guidelines, are performance standards. So we're looking at different ways to do that, either prospectively to evaluate and pick the right projects. That could be from one angle, and the other is we talk about in the implementing guidelines and in the Oversight Committee about periodic performance reviews. And again, those performance reviews would have to be against criteria, and that criteria could be decided now, or it could be decided later through guidelines that could evolve through the life of the program. And then one that Molly and I were just chatting a little bit about, her memo, the need, and I put it here, if any, because I don't think we're to the decision yet to say one way or the other that what we've laid out here in this draft would require changes to Measure J. Certainly, I think what we've laid out for the urban limit line we would have to address that, but in terms of a broader merging, we're certainly not to that point yet. And as soon as the draft is made available for circulation, Mala and her team and I and others will start working on drafting the ordinance based on what we see, and I think that'll give us inform us a little bit more about how much overlap there is. So with that, I think Bill hit it pretty succinctly on what we're really asking for tonight. We really want direction on the critical items that need to be fixed before you're comfortable with reviewing that. And then maybe it's not the appropriate word, but really empowering staff and the consultant team to go out and really work some of these issues hard, maybe push back on things a little stronger than we have, and work across all the committees to resolve where there's inconsistencies in what we're hearing, again, with the goal of putting together a cohesive plan that will resonate and one that we feel would be successful in November. So with that, I'll wrap it up and enter.
All right. Well, thank you. I do have a number of speaker slips. So Commissioner Arnerich, if you want to make a point now, but then I'll take speakers.
I actually did, and it's really to what Bill said, and I'll be succinct. The answer is no. I don't want you to go back and redo that list, but I have a different solution. The reason why is no. The RTCP's input from EPAC, although EPAC's been silent for a while, what we see, at least on the expenditure, not the words, the expenditure plan has really been worked by the RTCPs time and time again. A little hiccup maybe with WICTAC in a recent change that may do something, but they'll sort out their house. What you're saying is you want to go back and redo what everybody's done and go back to equity. It's been about equity. That what you can do is go back on that list and put a parallel column on which ones that we have high assurance versus low assurance, where we might qualify for funds. We also have to, we're smart enough to know now, let's look at the 5 and 10 year cycle. We know what's going to be here in matching funds or what isn't. And put that as another column to say these are. And then let people come back, and I think it's us, because we've been held at bay. We've really been held at bay. That's not a true statement on the transmittal letter. We haven't really talked about this. We're talking in circles. And I think it might be well-intended, but maybe disingenuous to the RTCPs, which are meeting every week to look at these and come back with comments, yet we're not taking their comments because, Ross mentioned they don't want to talk about any of the wording because we'll do that later. It says we have not talked about the wording in here. And those of us that represent cities have a list of things that we think ought to be talked about before it's circulated, because otherwise you're circulating. They saw all of this, so we have their comments on this. We have them right here, right? We got one just a little while ago. So we have the comments from the RTCPs. Several members here sit there. So I don't think it is wise for you and staff to go back and rework that list. You want to put another column and say, we believe these will qualify for matching funds. And then big asterisk. By the way, there are no funds that we know of that are available for these, because the world we live in for finances, the STIP monies, who knows when that's going to come back. Gas cap, we don't know what that's going to look like. And we only know a very short term, and we've lived now, if you look backwards at the federal level, we only know it's a 1 year, 2 year funding cycle. So we have been really successful in the past in getting matching funds. We'll be likely, but the fact is we have to be honest to our regional ones. So my answer is no.
All right, thank you. Well, I think this is something we'll come back and discuss as an authority later. I would like to move on to public comment. We have several speaker slips, and I ask you to each limit your comments to 3 minutes. And here we have a new timer that the speakers will be able to see, so you will know how far away you are.
We get to see it too.
We get to see it too.
Throw shoes. No offensive noise at the end.
All right, so our first speaker is going to be Ron Schmidt, followed by Patricia Bristow. So if our speaker comes up, and then the next speaker gets behind him or her. Welcome, sir. Go ahead.
I'm Ron Schmidt. I'm pastor of St. Anne Church in Byron. I'm also on the Byron MAC, and I wanted to thank the board for maintaining the $117 million in funding for East County Corridor that brings better access to East County, as well as Byron Airport and the 205-580 connection. This is critical because we are drowning in traffic. The roads that we have out there, Camino Diablo, a lot of parts of the Byron Highway have no paved shoulders, and the huge volume of traffic, it's a safety issue every day. The other thing that I wanted to emphasize is the need for the Highway 239 for economic development. We are kind of a dead cul-de-sac in a lot of ways, drowning in traffic, and the pastors of the area are constantly talking about how are we going to deal with the poverty that we're seeing out in our part of the county. We need economic development. The Northern Waterfront project, as well as the Byron Airport, I think are key to that. And so I think that we need to kind of look at safety, but also economics, and to take in consideration the needs of our part of the county. Byron could be officially designated as a blighted area, and we need to think about all the impacts of all that we're doing. So I thank you for your efforts, and to please keep our part of the world in consideration as you move forward. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you for your time. I'm Patty Bristow. I am on the Contra Costa Transportation Authority Citizens Advisory Committee. I'm also part of the Byron Library Club. I live in Byron. I live on Camino Diablo Road, and I was one of those nasty people that spent 2 years screaming to get the trucks off of Camino Diablo, and the supervisors did that for us, so it was great. However, they need somewhere else to go, not just Marsh Creek Road. State Route 239 was put on the county books 57 years ago. It's time. When you put in the new Vasco Road, and I grew up in Byron. I spent 34 years in education in Brentwood, and I watched Brentwood thrive. Thank you, Bob. And when they put in the new Vasco, they actually did what they were supposed to do. Because after you pass Camino Diablo Road and you go in a straight line, and then there's an S curve, the first part of that S curve was put in there for Route 239 so that it could connect to Armstrong Road. So please finish the job. We've got 250,000 people in East County, and they used to call us the Far East, like we were part of Asia or something. But we really need, for safety, if we have a disaster, we can't get out. So please, I appreciate it, and I certainly thank you for your time.
Following Mr. Nissen is Dave Campbell. Welcome.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mike Neeson. I've been a Byron resident since 1984, and I'm also a member of the Byron MAC. I've been involved in the heavy construction and the related transportation industries for over 40 years. And most of my commuting during that time has been traveling to Livermore. I go over Vasco in the morning and come back Byron Highway in the afternoon. So I've been in the middle of all the fun and action for years and years there. The prioritizing of the airport connector is vital to our area. This will provide much needed relief from the continuous lines of vehicles traveling past the Excelsior Middle School, the residents along the routes, and the churches along the Byron Highway and Camino Diablo as well. When the weight limit restriction was lifted on the Highway 4 bypass, the commercial vehicle traffic increased significantly through the area. I'm also noticing a lot more placarded big rigs coming through there now with hauling hazardous materials. So if we can get this connector and funded and come to fruition, it's going to be very beneficial for the safety of everybody impacted along this route. The connector will also bring about part of the transportation infrastructure improvements needed to access the Byron Airport and the future expansion that will be taking place out there. And it'll be great to see some much needed jobs being created out of this expansion, hopefully to be filled by some local residents to bring some economic benefits as well as improving the quality of life for these people whose daily commute sometimes can be hours and hours. We must also keep the bigger picture in mind. The roadways that the airport are connecting Vasco and the Byron Highway need also to be part of the discussion. Vasco Road serves thousands of commuters and commercial vehicles. Excuse my raspy voice here. Increase the safety as well as relief from the long backups that occur there, widening this roadway from 2 to 4 lanes would serve to address these problems. The Byron Highway is also in very serious need of improvement to address the safety and ever-growing traffic volume along there. in my experience, this has become the most dangerous road that I travel on. I see at least a couple of near-miss head-ons out there a week, if not more. It's horrible. So I'm asking that you please try to provide a means to widen and improve this roadway and work with the other stakeholders on down to 205 as well and getting that problem taken care of. And I'm out of time here, so I would like to thank all of you for providing the resources and supporting the projects that keep the traveling public and the commercial vehicles flowing safely and efficiently as possible out in our area, as well as the rest of the county. Thank you very much, and excuse my voice. Okay.
Dave Campbell, Advocacy Director with Bike East Bay. First, want to take this opportunity to remind everybody, save the date, May 12th, Bike to Work Day. It's also Bike to School Day. It's also Bike Day if you're not going to work or school. Get ready to ride your bike. If you can't ride your bike that day and need to drive slowly and watch out for people bicycling. And also, we encourage all of you not only to ride your bike, but to be good ambassadors on that day. You can walk, bike, even carpool down to your local Energizer station and be an ambassador to those who are bicycling. That'd be great. Here in support of 5% for the Bike PED program in this measure, but I want to step back and speak in support of staff's desire to take a look at a plan that maximizes our chances for victory in November. The plan that we're putting together right now is trying to incorporate as best we can all the input we're getting. That's great, beyond the RTPCs, but all the stakeholders. But I think it is time to look at a plan that maximizes our chances of winning in November. And I think at the next meeting, I'd like to see that plan, if not just that plan and some other plan that, tracks on the track we're on now. But what would a plan look like if it maximized our chances for victory? I would sure love to see that. And if it's got things in there I don't like, I need to know that. And I will accept that. Because I want victory in November. I want us to get more money for our needed transportation improvements. Commissioner Arnrich, perhaps a friendly amendment to your idea is, in addition to the column for where you would get additional funding from, put a couple more columns there. Which categories, if we added money to, would increase our chances of victory in November? Which ones, I think you know what I mean, a column for that. And maybe get a little more detail there. Which ones are going to help us run a more robust campaign if we have more money in them versus less? To use an example, and it's not the first time I said this, the 680 corridor, I get that corridor needs more money, and if that's what it takes to pass this measure, you have Bike East Bay support. Just don't take the money from the Bike PED category, mind you. But I understand the politics of that. We've got to get something together that works, and I know that's a very popular project. So that's what I'd like to see, hopefully, at the next meeting. Thanks.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Ron Brown. I'm representing Save Mount Diablo. I'm also a member of EPAC. And I have been one of what is a small group of EPAC members that represent a small but very diverse range of perspectives in the community that has been meeting for a number of weeks trying to discuss some of the very difficult and complex issues that are involved in creating a transportation expenditure plan. And while we don't have details for you this evening, I know that some of the staff and consultant team have been eager to hear some of our findings. We've been kind of locked in our room with our heads down and having what I think are intense, serious, and interesting conversations. And what I'd like to tell you is that at this stage in our dialogue, we have tackled a number of the issues and have come to agreements and some concepts that we think make sense for this measure. But I also want to tell you that there are several, as you will probably not be surprised to hear, several very serious issues that we are still in different points on and with different perspectives. And we are continuing to talk. We are attempting to put as much time as is reasonably possible into our continued conversations. And we would ask for your indulgence to give us at least another week in order to be able to come to completion on our process so that we can come back to you with a presentation that we think represents a plan, as Dave Campbell just said, that will be saleable and passable by the community, that will address the myriad of issues that are confronting this community given its transportation issues, and that will have a chance for success. So we will hopefully have that for you by next week. We'll be bringing it back to the next EPAC meeting as well. So thank you.
So I just wanted to ask a quick question. In your perfect world, what implication does that have for the suggested schedule that Mr. Chittenden laid out? Recognizing we have deadlines to get this on the ballot.
We are cognizant of the deadlines, and we remind ourselves of them all along the way. I think if I were to give you my best sense, we would appreciate having more time. But recognizing there are certain dates on the calendar that must be hit in order to have this move forward for the elections calendar, we're doing our best to live within those time constraints that have been discussed.
Welcome. Am I speaking into this? I'm Leslie Hunt. I represent Friends of the Creeks, which is a small nonprofit group based in Walnut Creek. And I'm here to talk about the RAMP, the Regional Advanced Mitigation Program. We certainly support the idea because it means there are going to be more dollars for programs to mitigate the transportation projects you do, and less will get spent on permitting and processing and other overhead. That said, however, the one paragraph that I have seen describing the RAMP talks about property in East County. We all share the burdens of our transportation system, and I think that we should also share the benefits too. There are a couple of ways to do this, either the three sections of the county or the clean water people on the various city staffs have divided the county into 5 groups of watersheds. When we think of mitigation, we usually think about greenfield sites. The HCP in East County tends to buy a ranch, do some things to fix it up, move on to the next ranch. But as someone mentioned earlier, that's also our food base, and we need to protect it. And I'm glad to see you're considering that in this measure. There are other ways of looking at mitigation sites, however. In the more urban areas of our county, there are sort of more brownfield things that were developed once and left to languish, that have, time has simply moved on from what was done with them, and now it's time to do something else. There are trees on streets to mitigate the heat island we create with our urban areas, also makes them more walkable, reduces pressure on the streets. And there are things like flood control structures that we would make in a much more green way today. So these things can improve life all over the county if several ramps are chosen with different objectives that will meet the different kinds of rules that are required for each kind of project there is, deal with proximity, etc. I'd like to return to the idea of watersheds as a basis for a moment. Everything needs to drink. Therefore, creeks become highways for wildlife, and they connect wildlife and people, and orienting mitigation toward watersheds will help us to knit our ecosystem back together so that we have green cities where we do all live. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for your time. I'd like to thank for listening to us, come and, including us into the funding. We appreciate that. I echo what my fellow Byron MAC member said. I am Steve Larson. I'm the vice chair of the Byron MAC. I appreciate I've been here a few times in the last month. I appreciate your listening to us. And I just want to reiterate, we need a high-volume road out there with a high-volume traffic we've seen. So thanks again, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you very much. And following Ms. Schmidt is Steve Barr, and after Ms. Schmidt, I only have 2 other speaker slips. So if you wish to speak and have not turned in your speaker slip, this would be a great time to do so. And welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Grace Schmidt. I live in Alamo. And I would like to call your attention this evening to your handouts. The second one in the handout packet is from SWAT, dated today, transmission of their positions. And I'd like to call your attention to page 5, the next to the last paragraph there. The preliminary TEP for the SWAT subregion was presented on at the August 3rd, 2015 SWAT meeting. The proposed funding plan listed a project as Alamo intersection improvements. Actually, it was an outline form, so it was under the major streets category. So Alamo major streets intersection improvements. Subsequently, Contra Costa County has requested a name change to the project. It should be retitled to Danville Boulevard, Orchard Court, Complete Streets. And I would like to explain that a bit because Alamo major streets intersection improvements, that language would widen any or all of our major intersections. And Alamo has been trying not to have that happen for about 8 years now, since 2008. We've been before SWAT, and we've been before TWIC, and we've been before the Board of Supervisors and TVTC, trying to have that not happen. So this name change is very important to Alamo. And Danville Boulevard, Orchard Court, Complete Streets, which is the name change we want to see, would actually describe the project that the Alamo MAC recommended for downtown Alamo, whereas Alamo major streets intersection improvements would describe something entirely different. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Following Mr. Barr is Joel DeValcourt, and his is the last speaker slip I have. Welcome.
Thank you. Steve Barr, Brentwood City Council. You've heard plenty of speakers on 239, so I'm going to just echo their comments. There's 2 other items that I'd actually like to address, and I think you're going to discuss some of these later tonight. Been much discussion about BART and their part of this transportation plan, and I think for Brentwood voters, I think it's clear that if we have the intent that the system will serve the Brentwood residents somehow, I think that's going to be important to our residents, that we know that the residents, not only for Brentwood but East County, that have actually been paying and contributing to that system, that there's a way for them to get a little better access than they currently have. We know it's extending to Antioch. Our hope that when we have the intent from the CCTA that it is to get an extension, or at the very least a way for BART riders to access the system either through a parking lot that I know we've discussed, and I know one of my residents that sits here and also sits on BART knows that it's important to us. I just like the CCTA to recognize that when you have that discussion. The second item is that I'd like to discuss is on ag preservation. I know it's a priority for us in Brentwood, and I know the rest of the county has the same feeling, and I think Brentwood has a program in place that mitigates development, and I'm proud to say that over time the development impact fees have generated about $12 million and preserved nearly, with the help of other partners, nearly 1,000 acres. So I think it's more appropriate that local agencies have the ability to put development mitigation measures in place that are suitable for their local area, because the same mitigation measure that maybe is good for Brentwood may be not suitable for someone like Lafayette or Richmond, and I think allowing the local voters a chance to weigh in on that, I think, is the best way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Joel DeValcourt, and that's the last speaker slip I have. Welcome.
Good evening. I've had a few weeks off. I hope you guys have been doing all right. I just wanted to just say a few brief comments based on some of the things that I'm hearing these days. And just for a quick framing, that we all know that there are a lot of impediments on the road to good policy making, and we all know that this tax measure has had a fair share already, and I imagine that there will be more in the next few months. But I want to just deliver a sobering message that, from what I'm hearing, the current TEP 2.1 is still a long shot, far cry away from shifting Contra Costa towards a transformational system, as well as transformational policies, both for the 21st century and beyond. And the rumblings are growing louder from the communities that I work. I'm hearing a lot of concern about the current proposals as not having gone far enough. And for the details on that, I'll just say look at the unaddressed list of EPAC comments that came out in the last month and a half. So I'd like to think that we can facilitate good policymaking in Contra Costa that can move us forward. And I hope we're willing to go a little bit further than what we're seeing tonight. And I encourage you as well to await some future proposals that I think might get us there. And I hope that we have the patience and we have the wherewithal to strike those kinds of compromises. So thank you very much.
So let me bring it back to the authority. There are some framing comments before we begin. There are a lot of things to discuss tonight, and if we share the goal or the request that's been voiced by staff, which is to indicate any further amendments we want to see in the TEP before it's circulated to the cities. Perhaps one approach is to go through the draft topic by topic, so we'll keep our discussion focused, and then at the end of that come to that list of items that Mr. Chittenden ended with, the 6 items, one of which Commissioner Arnovich commented on, and then go from there. Is that an acceptable approach?
May I make one comment, Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Thank you. And Joel, I'm glad you were gone in the sense that you got away and enjoyed a vacation, not that you were gone from here. But I did want to comment. I nudged Mr. Hudson over here. We did make a comment last week that this is not everything in the measure is transformative, but there are a number of things in the measure that are transformative. And I don't think we're going to be able to get 100% transformation in every issue that we're talking about. But looking ahead to technology and how we're doing things, there's a lot of transformation in this. And I just, I think I want to be real. I want to be open on the record that I believe there is a lot of transformation in this TEP, and there's still a lot of work to do, and I appreciate the comments that we heard, but we're moving away from a build it as much as you can into how can we meet future demands without having to do additional road work in the sense of expanding freeways. I know there's an issue on Highway 239. This body has discussed it. I know it will go back to the RTPCs, but that relates to goods movement and safety issues. And I think this board, I think of it as transformative because it gets heavy road trucks off the street and will help in that regard and move goods around so that we have the economic development that we need not only in East County but all over this county. So that's a transformative thing. So maybe we need sometimes to have a definition of what transformative means. Is what it really means.
All right, Commissioner Pierce, briefly before we begin the...
Yeah, very briefly. I just wanted to say that I think we shouldn't yet get too hung up on the numbers in the chart. While all of the RTPCs have massaged them some of those numbers are reflected here, some from Transpac that happened just last week are not yet into this chart because this was a packet that was produced about the same time as we met. So those numbers will shift somewhat as we go forward right up to the last minute. We know that from past experience. That happened last time. It'll happen again. And whether it's a 25-year plan or a 30-year plan or whatever year plan, we're going to make this work. I have no doubt about that. And I'm confident that the staff have heard many of the concerns and that balance will get worked out. The other thing is really that what we need to do is make sure that the categoric language that is in this initial draft is pretty close. There are a gazillion comments here, and once they're incorporated, it's going to sound different. And once it's incorporated by the folks who know how to write ballot language that the public will embrace, it will sound different still, but it will give us the latitude to do all of the things we've said we want to do, but in a way that is English and understandable by the public. So I think it's really important that unless there is a comment that is not captured in the notes, we give them direction to take all this mass of comments we've gotten in the last year. And please, you go with your experts and your expertise, put it back together, come back to us and show it to us then. Because we can massage these words. I do not want a wordsmith tonight. I did not bring my sleeping bag because I really don't think it's necessary. I think we have given a lot of input. And we need to see what that boils down to. Then if there's something that we've missed, we can fix it. But quite frankly, there are so many comments in this, once you put them all together, it's not going to look exactly like it does today. And I really think we need to do ourselves the service of hearing that. So unless there's something that's been missed in a comment, I think we ought to send them back with what's out there.
I think that's an excellent suggestion.
With that in mind, may I suggest that we turn to the preface, which is page 3. Yes.
You know, Don, I really would like to have the staff run us through this and give us the summary and see if there's direction that they think they don't have. And if there's something that they've missed totally, then we can raise a hand. But otherwise, let's bless it and get on with it.
Okay, Commissioner Arnerich.
And I agree with that.
Okay.
I like that methodology. It'll also give Dawn and everybody a fair chance. And I agree about not wordsmithing. But sort of a higher level view, this is not ready to send out. And by the way, it's only addressed, somebody said cities. It's not addressed to go to cities. It was only going to go back to RTCPs and the city managers. But it's a little disingenuous even to send it out. So we're having our EPAC partners say, well, we're going to come back with a proposal, some changes in that. We're wearing out some of the folks, but the wearing out is not going to work. That we're wearing out RTCPs, everybody keeps coming back thinking they're reviewing something that we're heading to. And if we're going to get something else that's different, and I'm sure it is going to be different, we ought to wait and not send this out, because then they're going to do it all over again. Because we need as a board to be able to see what that is, look at what we've been going down, figure out how to put this together, and then send it out. So I know we have a timeline. And I know what Ron said in a very diplomatic way. We're not ready yet, and we can't agree. Okay, great. Guess what? Deadline, get it in 2 weeks or whatever our next meeting is. You've got to get it in, or we're going to have to do what's being proposed. But we can't send this out. If that's our intention, we should just wait. So,
can I ask a question now? Understanding Newell's concern that he would like to see it before it gets circulated. You'd like to see it here at this board before it gets circulated. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
What I'd like to do is be able to have us give some direction to staff based on what we hear from the EPAC, for us to comment it and say, yes, this needs to go in, here's what we do. That otherwise, we should just go home, because we're sort of saying, give it to staff, EPAC will send. We're ultimately the elected folks that are responsible to make a recommendation and to carry it out.
Then let me suggest this. Because realistically, staff has been listening to EPAC for a very long time. They've got a lot of the comments from the various stakeholders. Just because the various stakeholders can't all agree with each other doesn't mean that the staff can't make a stab at putting something together. Now, if EPAC actually gets something to the staff in the next week, hopefully, they can incorporate what they think is appropriate using their best judgment of what they've heard us say, what they've heard the city manager say, what they've heard all the other stakeholders say. And perhaps, and I'm going to ask staff, particularly the consultants who will be doing the heavy lifting on the writing here, what do you expect your turnaround on the redraft would be, and is it possible that by April 6th or possibly the 13th, it would be back here before it gets released to all these other folks for us to give it a look-see and make sure it's on track. I think that's what Newell is asking, is that we at least get a chance to see it before it gets circulated and everyone thinks we've blessed it when we really haven't.
Well, there's two parts of my reaction to that. One is the substantial input from the EPAC subcommittee or coalition that's working is significant. I don't think it's fatal for tonight. I think if we have it, and I maybe suggest if they say they can have it in a week, set a deadline for a week, because we've got to have it. Now, our recommendation, staff's recommendation on that issue would be to release this draft, and we will next week issue an errata that shows how we would modify it for that. But we need to get the process started. The other, so that on the issue of that substantive change, because that's the one where I see the most substantial change possible. I haven't seen I've had ideas, but what I've also heard is that they're working to have a package, and that package is complete, and staff is not going to, at least not going to recommend that we take a stab at pieces of it. We're going to wait for the whole thing, and then we'll deal with it. I think we can turn it around relatively quickly, conceptually. And I think one of the things I would like to emphasize is what we're really asking, this document is really more legislative intent. This is not the document that's going to go in front of the voters. And with respect to reformatting, we cannot have a new draft this time next week reformatted. We need the whole month of April to do that. Now, I think the issue for you is that have we changed substantially what it is? Using, for example, the preface. I've asked BMWL to look at this through the lens of the voter, and based on the polling information, all the information. And they have come up with a draft that reads a lot different, but it says the same thing. And then by reference, they're proposing or suggesting is that we use a link to our webpage to make sure that your words exactly are available to the voters that want to see it. But so there's two things. One is format issues that are going to make, because you've asked us, our goal really here is to help you develop a consensus-based plan that has the best chance of passage to the voters in November. That's the goal. Now, all of us, I'm not an expert of that. I've got a team of people that I think are. Eric's sitting next to me with the kind of the political lens, and we've got communications and others. So I think the issue is we need to get this out on the street. We have a lot of comments. I hope that we have pretty much understand what the important local projects are, the recommendations on funding. I think we can accomplish that. But I'll tell you that having some of these items the way they are is not going to be attractive to the voter. Now, we might be correct, and we all agree to each other what it is, but if your goal at the end of the day is to pass it and have $2.3 billion to administer, then I think we have to have some flexibility. We need, and Eric's right, we do need policy direction. And what we're asking for is policy direction related to these issues that Ross outlined tonight.
So let me express a little frustration here, because I think we're asking the cities to travel two parallel paths. And I think a lot of the cities, in a sense, haven't had a chance to discuss either one in detail. Some of the RTPCs have, some haven't, I think. They've been reacting to versions of this. But I think there are probably very few cities that have seen this document. There are probably very few that sort of know where it is. Essentially, this suggestion puts us in somewhat of a bind, because the desire is to get comments back by April 22nd. You're telling us that we can't get them the second version until maybe the 10th or the 14th of April. Some of the cities are going to look at it at a very high level and say it looks good or it doesn't. And some of the cities are going to want to look at the words. I know that some of the cities in the SWAT region, there are city managers who read each word and think about the implications of that for their cities. So I guess I'm sort of looking for a way out of this, because we're sort of asking them to look at two documents simultaneously when one isn't ready yet. And while we understand that EPAC is working on an alternative, we know they've been working on it for some time. I think neither we nor they know when it's going to be available. They have a guess. So, I mean, I'm trying to say, how do we help the cities out of this, what I see as a big conundrum?
Well, I think, well, my initial reaction is that the RTPCs are made up of the local agencies. So I would hope for the most part, and maybe we don't send it back to the cities in this intervening period, because what the city's real issue for the cities is an up or down vote after May, after you release the draft. It won't be a draft then, it'll be a final draft proposal. You send it to the board, you send it to the cities, and you ask for an up-down vote, and we need 50% of the cities representing 50% of the population. Now, a majority, I'm sorry. But anyway, the formal approval by the cities is the June timeframe. The informal review that we had built into the schedule at your request was to have a draft at about this point in time that cities could look at and see, are we close or not? And then that feedback would go back through the RTPCs to your board, and those 3 meetings in May is for us to reconcile all that. And at that point, you'll have the format. And again, legislative intent's what's important, and that's what's been a bit concerning to us, is that worrying and and/ors and stuff like that. We know this is the first draft, so that's the part that we're at.
Commissioner Hudson, and then Commissioner Abelson, and Commissioner Pierce.
I think everything, I'm not going to restate it, but I'm really concerned if we delay getting something to the cities. I think it's going to take some of us a little longer to explain where we are. And I go back to, we started this whole process out as a subcommittee. I don't want to say failed, but it didn't make it with the subcommittee, and the complaint was, well, the communication coming back, well, things were changing so fast, just as they are now. But we've got to stick to some kind of a timeline. We have to bring in, I'll just say, I have to bring in 4 other council members who I don't think have followed any of this, other than to say, well, there's a bond measure, or there's a sales tax measure, or there's something coming. And then when it's dropped on them, they know a lot of these people out here, and they're going to tell them, I don't like this, I do like it, there's something else. We need to find out if there are some cities that are going to need a little bit more explanation too, because I believe it's 75% of the cities and 75% of the population, and we need to verify, because that's what it was in J. Okay.
I would just say, if you need a 2/3 vote and you only get 50% of the cities with a 50% or majority of the population, you've lost.
Well, then the point I want to stress is there are a lot of people out there that think something's coming, but they don't really have, I don't want to say a clue, but they really don't know what is coming. They just know something's coming, and the sooner we get something more concrete in front of them, we're going to find out if there's an objection, and that needs to happen sooner than later.
Okay, Commissioner Abelson.
Yes, I noticed that it's now 7:20, and I feel like we haven't done anything at all yet tonight, and I'm a little concerned about that. And I actually think, when I look at this and I think about the voters in my area, there's a problem, because a lot of the things that are important to the voters in my area are kind of missing from this, or they've been changed into this thing that nobody knows what it is. And my city didn't actually vote for Measure J. We did not pass it by 2/3, for example. We failed to do that, so we weren't happy last time with it. And I actually, and maybe this one looks worse, but I have a great desire to express the concerns, to not even be able to express the concerns that I prepared to express tonight, just because we want to push it through. I just really don't understand, and I think we should just move on, go through the comments, and see where it leaves us. I don't know that it couldn't. I think things can be fixed in terms of what I'm talking about, but they can't be fixed if we don't even talk about it. Thank you.
Commissioner Pierce.
I was certainly not suggesting we not talk about it, and I certainly don't think we've wasted the first hour of this meeting, because I think the public comments were important to the process. But that said, I think an expedited run through to make sure all of our comments are incorporated, that we haven't missed any of our comments. I think it's important to make sure those are added into, and if what we're going to send to the city is this annotated version, I'm a little nervous about that, but that may just have to be what it is. I think some of the cities are going to look to their representative, to their RTPC, and say, you're going to have to give a presentation, tell us what this means, because unless someone can give a presentation on this, and unless we're prepared to staff some of those presentations to the cities, I think it's going to be very confusing for some of them, because a lot of this is Greek to the folks who are not members of the RTPCs. So I think we ought to dive in, run through this, have the consultants lead us through what the changes are, ask if there's any changes that are jumping out that we've missed, and get on with it and get it moving.
Mr. Chair, I must comment. Not only do I agree with Commissioner Pierce, we're not here tonight to express any concerns or lack of concerns by any particular jurisdiction. This is a body made up of RTPCs in the county. So I would urge constructive dialogue around what Commissioner Pierce just said relative to the comments this body has said. If a person, and Janet, I don't mean to point you out, but it's not your role tonight to bring out what El Cerrito doesn't like. It's your role tonight to bring out what WCTAC doesn't like, so that when this goes to El Cerrito, that then that's the opportunity for each of us who represents a city or the county to make our comments. So if we can move forward in that spirit so that we're not here all night with each of us going back and forth, well, my city wouldn't like this or my county area wouldn't like that, and it's the RTPC comments, and there's two of us from each RTPC. Thank you.
Just a point of clarification, and I've been a little confused. Some of you were talking about sending to the city, says this is going to city councils. Staff had said this is going to the city managers and back to the RTCPs, because the submission when we submit it to the city councils is the final. So that we're not doing. This is not what this is, because we're dead if we are. This is not. So we're going back to vet out a revised version, which I'm hearing articulated in several ways, that would reflect all the comments from everybody. A new version, okay, right? That's what they said. And then get comments from that, ultimately to get us to another one. Here's one version, but they're talking about creating version, not version 2.1, a version 3, which is new, waiting for a fourth version. So am I correct on that?
Well, I think so, but my assumption is that some of the managers will take this to their councils.
That's going to be dangerous.
Well, but I mean, I think it's dangerous for the managers to comment in some cases without taking it to their councils, dependent upon the nature of their council.
Let's ask the consultant.
Yeah, Mr. Zell.
Well, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. I you know, in the past, we didn't go to the cities at this point in the process, and with the time frames we have, I don't think you're going to be able to go to the cities, have every city take this up amongst hundreds of electeds who may not have seen it yet, and then hope that we're going to somehow meet a timeline that we're under. I think that a lot of work's going to have to get done at the point where this is sent to the cities, where we're basically giving them June to review this document, and we're going to have to work and go to the cities in that regard. The original setup was that the RTPCs are representing city perspectives. And if you recall, we made a big deal, and Newell made this very point at mayor's conferences, that we really wanted the cities to make sure that they were updating themselves as we went along. If they, in fact, are not doing that, I'm not sure we can do it again. We will get to them, but I'm very concerned that if you go back to 19 cities, that we're just never going to get across. I think the coalition that is working on some of these issues, they're going to have something for us within the week, basically is what Ron Brown said. I think once we have that, I think we're ready to go forward with a draft that represents everything we've heard. What we want to make sure is that we're not going forward with a draft that does not represent the policy of this authority.
So let me ask you a question.
Not whether every word in here is correct, but it has to represent the policy direction of this authority as worked out between yourselves and ourselves.
So it's a timing question.
Yes.
If you receive a document from EPAC, say after April 7th, when the next EPAC meetings, and the authority agrees that this represents policy direction this evening, when would you send something to the RTPCs and city public managers?
As soon as we've got enough input from yourselves, EPAC's meeting soon.
April 7th.
So after they've had a chance to review what, as a result of what happens this evening, we can certainly provide it to them. What's important, I believe, is that the negotiations that have been going on between the business community and the environmental community and others represents very much a core of that EPAC. And so if there's a direction coming from that joint coalition, I believe that the rest of EPAC's input is, while important, we already know where many
But I guess
of
what I'm
the
trying to
other
understand is, assume the authority says this document looks good tonight.
Mm-hmm.
Does this go to PMA this week?
Well, that would be the intent, is that we would send it out with the request to review. The other point I'd like to bring up is if we can come out of tonight's meeting with what Eric and Bill are calling as the policy direction of this board, when we get something from EPAC or the other group, at least we have something to benchmark against so we know where there's similarities and differences. Because if we're still unclear if this really represents the direction that you'd like to state as of March 29th, subject to further consideration with more input, we as staff and the consultant team really don't know necessarily where we're on the mark or where comments from others may be on the mark with what we've agreed to and where we could flag the differences. So that would be another benefit of going through the process, is that we'd just have something to benchmark against as we get additional comments.
Okay.
Can I just add to Ross's comment, Ross? Just, I mean, if this authority is meeting again next week, and if we're going to have some additional input from the coalition within this week, I would just ask why we wouldn't wait for that and have that available to this authority so that what gets put out is a result of next week's meeting.
In part because one of the early suggestions from staff is that we wrap this up tonight so that we don't have to meet next week.
But you're doing
I understand that's an alternative.
That doesn't make sense. From my perspective, what they're going to come up with is, frankly, most likely going to be the most difficult part of this for everybody to grapple with. And so to go out and distribute something that doesn't represent some significant policy issues, you're just going to go right back at it again.
I think that's what a lot of the conversation has been, and I think we're we're hearing somewhat different things from different advisors.
Well, you're right, and I apologize for we're having a discussion.
We're having a real-time discussion.
We're having a real-time discussion, and so I'm raising that as an issue. We don't have a chance to vet every issue before we start talking about it.
Okay, so can we assume then that we need, if we can get all our comments in tonight, policy comments, make sure those are incorporated tonight. Then when EPAC gets theirs done, or the subgroup gets theirs done and goes to the EPAC on the 7th, then theoretically you can incorporate those and be back to us by the 13th at the very latest?
No, that's not what they're saying.
I know that's a tight turnaround, but I don't know how we're going to get it all done otherwise for us to have a chance to look at it before you put it back out to the city managers and the RTPCs.
Well, where I'm going with is what Erica's suggestion. Let's face it, EPAC has pretty much weighed in on this, and now there's this coalition that's a subset of EPAC, and they seem to be the one driving that train. So I would recommend that they get it into you by Friday. We've got Brown Act requirements so that you can incorporate that into whatever the package is that goes out for us to begin talking about this next Wednesday, April 6th. I know EPAC is meeting the 7th. I've never understood why EPAC is meeting the 7th, but besides that, you can take it to EPAC. They can come, individual members, but I think the core group that has the concerns that you've been mentioning, Eric and Bill, will be in this document that we can get, and they have to get it to you by Friday. This group has been meeting and meeting and meeting. We've had these deadlines. Friday is the drop dead date. Get it in so it can be in the package, and we can begin this conversation next Wednesday.
Commissioner Glover and then Commissioner
So I
Taylor.
think that we're at a point where we need to start a conversation here to make sure that our comments as policymakers are included in whatever comes from EPAC or anyone else before we get to that point. I think that we've heard the speakers that's been out there, and those are comments that we should try to also incorporate within what you come up with as a final draft. So I'm thinking that staff and our consultant team needs to hear from this body so that we could move forward and be able to try to meet these timelines that have been set. So if it's the direction, then let's get started making the comments, or we will be here till 2, 3 in the morning trying to, once concluding that that's the direction that we need to go.
Commissioner Taylor, and then perhaps we can begin the discussion.
Yeah, I have nowhere to go tonight, so I guess the last thing I want to do, and I've not missed a meeting, and neither have we. Worked very hard on this, everybody, consultants and all the participants. The last thing I want to do is go to my city with a plan that we're going to come back with another plan, because that won't make the plan right. So I would like to vet it out, get it kind of, we vet here tonight, we get every comment's made, we put it together, and then we have something substantial that we can come back and I can take to my council and says, this is where we're at and this is what we're kind of going to do. I have to convince 4 people. I'm 1 vote. So I don't want to go back and say, oh, by the way, we changed our minds. Not good.
So I think what I'm hearing is, for a variety of reasons, we're not where we wish we were this evening. We are not approving a document that is ready for public review. Yet, we're essentially trying to set the policy direction, which would then have some limited circulation. And we would get a document that would be ready for policy review sometime in April, which we would then ask the public managers and the RTPCs to comment on one more time, and then we would release that to the cities and the county. Is that correct? Okay, so.
Are we going to go through every comment here tonight?
No, I guess my sense is, given what was discussed before, is that if we see that there's a policy area that has not been addressed by the current document or is not incorporated in one of the current comments for staff to consider, that we voice that. Otherwise, we just say the issues that we're concerned about have been addressed, or at least have been mentioned, and we're going to leave it to staff to incorporate those, wait for the comments from EPAC, which I agree with Commissioner Mitchoff, should be in by Friday because we are running out of time. We were a public agency. We were required to respond to the Brown Act. And we hold our meeting on the 6th. We understand what the consultant and staff recommendation is to change the policy direction, if at all, based on those comments, and we have a chance to hear those comments. And then we direct staff to prepare a document in proper language that we can review in May and send to the cities with an interim version going to the public managers.
I think you're absolutely right, Mr. Chair, and I was just consulting with my colleague. From the county's perspective, as a member of this body, we think the concerns that we've had in the past on policy issues have been addressed, and their document is ready to go based on the information that they'll get on Friday to put in there. So perhaps each RTPC members can comment that way, what isn't in there as a, so that we can give that policy direction.
Okay, is that an acceptable? Commissioner Romick.
Go ahead.
Can I just get
Commissioner McCoy.
Can I get a moment of clarification? So we're talking about getting these comments and coming back next week and finalizing something. And that would go out to the RTPCs and the city managers. And when would it go to them?
Well, I think what I'm sort of hearing is we give comments tonight on the policy.
Right.
EPAC gives comments to us by Friday.
It comes back to this
It
board
comes back to us on
next
Wednesday with the recommended changes to our policy that we adopt tonight, if any.
Right.
We then direct staff to prepare a draft, version 4 of the document in new language, et cetera, and maybe make a presentation at the April meeting of the PMA to get feedback from the public managers, have discussions with the RTPCs, and then in May, we essentially start working on the final version of the document that goes to cities.
Okay, I'm just a little fuzzy on that timeline going back to the RTPCs.
Okay.
Okay, so from the what's
So we're at the end of the orange bar, which is to finalize again the legislative document as Bill describes it. So whether it's in the right language for public consumption, it's at least we internally and with the other members of our consultant team, we understand the intent of what we're saying, and that's really what we want to verify in April. So what I'm kind of hearing maybe from Commissioner Mitchoff is we're completing that review now, tonight, possibly. We were under the assumption that, particularly with the items that we listed that still need working on, that we want to continue to solicit RTPC participation through April, which is basically that blue 5 or 6 week period. So I think as it's evolved here, I think we're pretty close to what staff's intent was here tonight is, let's kind of wrap it up from, again, the policy direction that you would like to provide. Hopefully sometime soon we'll see an alternate perspective from the EPAC or the representatives of EPAC, and I think we'll just have to react to that, and we'll have to react quickly. Again, I think having something that, and again, I'm sorry, Commissioner Arnerich, if we didn't communicate correctly, we weren't, the green bar up there is where we go out for the formal approval of councils and the Board of Supervisors. So that May 16th date has to be in the final language, the language that's going to ultimately go to the ballot, and that's what we would circulate with the cities. So this 6 week period here, again, we'd ask you to talk about it at your councils, really dig into it at the RTPCs, and give us feedback on the items that we're still working on. Again, there's some differences of opinion from some of the RTPCs, so I don't know that we're going to resolve that tonight. So staff and consultants can work with your staffs, the RTPC staffs, and the members of the RTPCs to negotiate those differences. But that was really this 5 week period. I used to talk about, we'd hope that the draft would be maybe 85% good, or the initial draft be 85% good. We want to come out here tonight as something that's 90% good, knowing there's still that 10% we need to work on. So we want to be close tonight, but we know it's still draft and it still needs some work, and that's why we are going to continue to work with PMA and the RTPCs.
Okay, maybe I'm just missing something, because I want to understand, are we going to have the next version that comes to the RTPCs, is that going to have the EPAC's comments in it or not? So it will. So it's not going to come out until after the 6th. So maybe by I'm just, because they want comments back by the 22nd.
Right.
So we're going to have basically 2 weeks to get it back and comments. Is that correct?
Well, I think what I'm hearing is even if we get the comments back by the 6th, by the time we get something out to the RTPCs, it's probably likely to be up to a week later.
No. Can't be. Right, that's what I'm, the time frame for the RTPCs to review is getting very, very short.
Yes, it's going to be short.
But supposedly, when we get these things, there's going to be some black and white. The policy
Right.
direction was this, and we're getting a comment on this. Up or down, it shouldn't take a lot of time other than additional RTPCs meeting outside our normal meetings. That's how I'm looking at this.
Just a perspective. Ross and I had hoped, the team had hoped that this Friday, after tonight, we would incorporate whatever changes and we'd have something that we release. I think what I'm hearing quite simply is that's now April 8th. If you want to meet next week, and I do agree that having the input from the Business Environmental Coalition, and we'll be prepared to have this discussion. And what we're going to want, as Eric has said, and Ross, is that we want the policy direction on the issues that they're going to raise as it relates to the draft that we have. Now, we're not going to be so presumptuous to include all or part of what they're recommending. We will be in a position to recommend that in the draft that's released, and it would be still draft 3.0, the one that we're going to release, same title and everything else. It would just go out a week from this Friday instead of this Friday. I mean, I'm rough on days, but that's the idea. So we're basically cutting that
right.
4 to 5 week period to 3 or 4 week period. But so I think that answers the question. If we don't get it out, we're going to back ourselves into a.
No, I understand. That's why I think why you hear a number of us pushing EPAC in particular to provide us with their comments.
That's right.
What?
I was going to say, it's like when you have roommates, we've all made an agreement, we're going to share the rent and everything, and it's your turn to clean up. If EPAC, and I appreciate what they're doing, and I know what most of those issues are. They're pretty well identified. If they can't agree, then that's okay. Tell us what those are, but we really need to go to a point. It's not appropriate, because otherwise it's going to feel like somebody's trying to hold us up. And if you are, tell us and let's be friends, and I'm kicking you out of the room. But my point is we really need it, and if you can't agree on that, then tell us. Tell us what those are, because ultimately we're the ones that got to help balance that and move it out, and I'd really like to get to it.
Right.
And while you might shake your head and say, well, I don't know if we can, you certainly can tell us what you agree to and what you don't. We at least need to hear that.
So given that, if our objective tonight is to say, does the draft in front of us fairly reflect our policy direction as opposed to particular wording? Are there areas where commissioners believe it does not represent their policy direction or the direction of their RTPC? Commissioner Abelson and then Commissioner Romick was first and then Commissioner Abelson.
Okay, one of the areas.
No, I said Commissioner Romick first and then Commissioner Abelson.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the question is staff or not, but from Transplan's consideration, we are sufficiently okay with what is here right now.
Thank you. Commissioner Taylor, agree?
Yes. We don't need to just rehash, because we keep taking it back. Well, pretty soon you keep changing.
The answer is yes. Thank you.
Yes.
Commissioner Abelson.
I have some concerns I want to talk about, and I took it back to WICTAC, and they're with me on the bus issue.
Okay.
You remember from before? Do you want me to talk about it now?
This is the same issue you raised previously at the last meeting?
Yeah, but I actually noticed some things in the wording that I'm talking about the policy direction that need to be discussed.
That's what we're doing.
Do you want me to do
Please,
that now?
yes.
Okay. One of the things that I noticed, let's see if I have to now find it here. First of all, if you, in the attachments under the WICTAC thing, WICTAC reiterated with everyone except Tom Butt voting positively that they wanted the category to be named bus operations and improvements rather than bus and non-rail transit enhancements. So I did confirm that, as was requested by this group. And what I was noticing when I looked at the wording is that what it was saying was that I'm trying to find it now really fast because we didn't go through it in orders. 12, I believe, right? Somewhere around there. the purposes for it would be to increase, it says here in the wording, to increase ridership using incentives to increase frequency, capacity of high demand routes, and provide other, a whole series of things. What it doesn't say, however, is that it's serving what I would call the Environmental Justice Committee, it's sometimes called. And I'm concerned about that we haven't captured that as a need, and I think that should be added. And I really kind of think it was an oversight. I don't think there was an intent to do that. So and some of the things that are listed are not necessarily consistent with serving the Environmental Justice community. So, for example, just the environmental, you may want to actually go to the grocery store on a bus, for example. You may not want to go to the BART station, but you may want to go to the doctor's office, that kind of a thing. So it isn't always this, the things that are listed here. And we need to add that, I believe. And I would also root once again, as I was instructed to do by WCTAC, for that other wording and not this other non-rail transit, which I still don't quite know what it is. And that's kind of what I have to say about that.
Comfortable if we direct staff to consider that language in the draft they come back to us with in April?
Mr. Chair, I have to ask, and I'll ask Janet, there's environmental justice throughout this entire TEP, so I'm not sure why we would put it in one specific place or add it. It's part of our core values of what we're trying to accomplish here.
I
So I'm
didn't
not
say
sure
that it was or wasn't somewhere else. I'm saying I don't see it here.
But that's what I'm saying, Janet. It's throughout the entire TEP of what we're trying to address. That's why Mobility Matters is in there. That's a whole thing, as what you're talking about, for people to be able to use it. Take a bus to wherever you want to go. We want to make buses more available for people to get on to go where they're.
There is a point in this document where it talks about the use of this money in this particular category is reviewed every 2 years.
Okay.
Okay. I don't think it does that about any other category, so I don't think it's similar, and I don't know how you can buy a bus that lasts for 12 years and costs, $1 million a bus, more or less? Half a million?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, well, $500,000.
So maybe staff can answer the question of why they need to have this reviewed every 2 years, and I'm not sure that that's correct. I don't know. I haven't read that part of it. Is this the only section that has to be reviewed every 2 years?
This is the only one that's specifically called out to be reviewed every 2 years. Peter might correct me, paratransit maybe as well. The other categories we put on this every every year we do a fourth of them. So maybe to answer Chair's question here, when the language that was put together here was really geared towards increasing the efficiency and headways for transit, the high demand routes. So if you read in here, a lot of it talks about the high demand routes and last mile to major transit nodes and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's what your comments about, that it should be brought.
It's about both things. It's about, in other words, it isn't just getting people to work that needs to be covered. In this category, it's getting people to all the different places they go. And if you think about anybody, most of the places they go to, the trips are not to work, they're to all the different parts of their life. And people who use the bus, for their main mode of transit, use it.
So here, let me test something.
Outside of those high demand routes.
So let me test it again, because the assumption going into this, or the intent of the language here, is that we have Measure J that continues, that provides a lot of that service. So as new funding, it would be more targeted. So is that the comment, that it should not be targeted, that it should be more?
The comment is that there is a need for more of the I'll call it service routes. I don't even know if that's the right word, but there is a need for more of the service routes. In some parts of this county, for example, there isn't any, even I believe, service on Sunday at all.
So I think
People can't get to church.
this would be a good test of what we're trying to do here tonight. So if that's the will of the board, yes, we could take this and rework this, because I think I'm hearing the request from Commissioner Abelson is that the intent as written here is a little different than having a more broad-based funding that adds to existing service.
And the intent's here. There's nothing wrong with the ones that are here, so we need to add something to cover this other thing.
Okay, Commissioner Hudson and then Commissioner Simmons.
I don't know any other way to do this than to be blunt. You changed this wording from bus and non-rail. San Ramon's out. I will go back. I mean, what are we trying to do with the shuttles? It's not a bus. It's to change the way we do busing. It's a direct, that's the transformation, a direct line into an intermodal and into the shuttles throughout the business park. They're trying to get them down to 10 minutes. And we're talking about we've got to do buses on Sunday rather than that. I mean, these people eat me alive. And I'm the one that should be complaining. I'm the one that gets caught every time I can't get out on a flight and got to walk home from BART because I killed the service out of, anyway. But the reality here is, it's BART's fault. I mean, what have we been working towards with AB 1592 and you know, at the Gomentum station? No, that non-rail is a major part of what we're doing here.
Commissioner Simmons, Commissioner Durant, and then Commissioner Arnold.
I actually turned my mic off after listening to Commissioner Hudson, and I think he explained a point that I was not fully picking up on, which deals with San Ramon and the use of other than buses to accomplish non-rail transit. And I think Commissioner Abelson was probably reacting to that as I initially reacted to it, which is it was a carryover from the past, and you know we needed to focus here, and most of the attention has been focused on buses and improving buses. So I turned off my mic, but I'm still commenting anyway. And I understand why the language is there, and I think that is helpful to understand because it just looked like it was this is a not BART type of thing, and that was troublesome for me in looking at it. The second part is I think the sentence that talks about funding may be used is very restrictive in its language, and I think Commissioner Abelson is right that needs to be broadened so that it allows other things. And in some respects, I'm not sure San Ramon could use all of that language either because of how restrictive that language is.
I do note that the last sentence of that paragraph says funds may be used to deliver transit capital projects or operate service improvements identified in the adopted plans of an operator or of the authority. So if an operator has a plan to do what Commissioner Abelson suggests, then this money could be used for that. So I'd like to think that covers your request. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not saying that the San Ramon area shouldn't do what it wants to do. I'm saying that they should do what they want to do, but in West County we should also be able to do.
And I understand. I'm just questioning whether that last.
A very different thing.
Right. I'm just questioning whether that last sentence in the first paragraph.
But I'm also concerned about that.
The
part about every 2 years we have to do this planning process, where nowhere else in this document does it. No other category does it require that.
Well, we can change that, Janet, but can you answer his question on that last? No, you didn't, not on the last sentence.
What was the question?
The funds may be used to deliver transit capital projects or operate service improvements identified in the adopted plans of an operator or the authority. It gives you that. Bob's going to show you.
Yes, I already said yes.
Then all we need to issue and talk about is the 2-year issue.
All right, so Commissioner, given that we resolved part of this, I think, Commissioner Durant and then Commissioner Arnold.
Yeah, well, I may be unresolving part of it because part of the challenge, it seems to me, with the language is actually the follow-on sentence, which essentially restricts the funding to transit operators. And I don't know that handles shuttle buses. And my understanding of this category, different than Commissioner Abelson's, was it was broad enough to allow bus only in West County through a transit operator if that's really what West County wanted to do with their funds. But it allowed for other regions to use other non-rail transit to facilitate all of the wonderful things we're talking about. But I did not, I'm not convinced that you can only get there using existing transit operators.
Well, it says
Okay.
or the authority.
Well, not on that sense, it doesn't. It does at the last sentence. But in the middle section, funding will be allocated by the authority to Contra Costa transit operators based on performance criteria. And so that sentence would need to change, but let me go essentially along with Commissioner Hudson. If we're to change the entire category and bootstrap everybody in the county by what West County wants, then you can rest assured I'm out on this and would vote no on it. The fundamental reality is bus transit may work and may be appropriate for West County, and this allows West County to make that choice. But to have all of the other RTPCs hamstrung and confined to West County's vision for what's appropriate non-rail transit, I'm not on board with that.
So can I suggest that, since we're here to discuss policy direction, that the language is a bit unclear to several of us. Whether you thought it was clear or not, it's not relevant. It's unclear to us. And so the direction, I think, of the authority is that we want to be able to fund both bus transit and other alternatives, that we want the flexibility by region to fund that through bus operators or through alternative providers. Is that an acceptable policy or language? Thank you.
Except for the 2-year thing.
Yeah, well, hang on.
Okay.
And as long as it's clear with that last sentence, which is how I read it, the beginning part talks about sort of future advances, and West County's intent is to be able to use it for bus transportation that is existing, and perhaps just allows greater mobility for people, but doesn't necessarily represent a leap in technology.
We understand that. Can I suggest that we have a review every 4 years? Is that acceptable?
Just as a point of clarification, what do we do on your, that school bus program we have, or are we mandated or something for money? I can't remember that. I want to look, Peter would know about it. Is there some kind of a mandate or
We provide a report to the authority every
Yeah.
2 or 4 years.
Okay. I'm just looking at consistency. If it isn't, then forget it. I mean.
Okay.
One option would be to just delete it, assuming we keep in the reviews that's specified in the implementing guidelines.
That's fine.
Is that okay?
Yes.
All right, that way everything would be consistent? Okay, Commissioner Peoples, and I'd like to move off this item. I think we have a concurrence now.
Let me make 2 comments.
Okay.
For labor, a shuttle is a bus driven by a non-union contractor making minimum wage, and you're going to get major problems if you try to do that. Secondly, on the language that you think is saving, it is quite problematic because it specifies enhancements. And we went through this during the 2008 crash when we had to jump through all sorts of hoops to use money that had been specified for enhancements to maintain basic service. So it's got to be tweaked to be service or enhancements or something like that. And the shuttles, I raise that just because there's nobody from labor on here, and you got to understand they're quite sensitive about that. But I agree with what the commissioner said. There's vastly different needs in different parts of the county, and there are parts of the county where if autonomous vehicles ever get going, they will probably be the way to go. I don't think that's true for West County.
Are we happy to move on?
No, I have one more comment on this, and recognizing the comment that Commissioner Peoples made and the validity of it. The real issue, and one of the reasons for me non-rail matters and it not be transit operators, is, for example, we have in Pleasant Hill a senior van service that is run entirely by volunteers. So it's not people working at minimum wage, it's people who volunteer. And in the past, we've used sources of fundings to help us acquire the van to make it possible to actually run the service. And the service serves the community that it serves far better than anything else available in the county. In one very real sense, it's a model for mobility for seniors that could be replicated throughout the county but you would need funding for being able to obtain the vans, service the vans, perhaps pay the dispatchers. Thank you. That's where I was going. Dispatchers, because that's our biggest challenge. That and sometimes we have a shortage of volunteer drivers. But if you don't have the funds to even buy a little van to make this work, to get people to doctor's appointments and a bunch of the stuff that Commissioner Abelson was talking about, that's part of what bothered me about the concept is I think you have to have this more expansive sort of approach to serving the needs of the community we're trying to serve with this service.
I think that some of that may spill into the transportation for seniors and people with disabilities. Right.
Mixing categories.
Right. Okay, Mr. Zell.
Well, I just want to say that the art of this is basically making sure that all the region's needs are getting met the way they want to be met, but we have to have flexibility in this program. You cannot tie this program down over 25 to 30 years and not allow for changing circumstances to change it. So just give us that task.
I think that's the task we're giving you. That's the task we're giving you, and Okay, so Commissioner Abelson, were there other policy issues you had in the entire document?
Me?
You.
Okay.
We're sort of, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I can't.
Yeah, the people from Transplant have agreed they don't have any others. So.
Let me start back at the beginning just to look.
Well, while you're thinking, let me move on to SWAT.
Go ahead.
Well, if you're ready. If you're not ready,
now.
maybe, okay.
Okay, I just had to turn the page.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know what RAMP means.
Regional Advanced Mitigation Program.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I wouldn't mind
Fine.
taking a minute to address that, because I've heard a lot of descriptions of this, which is not necessarily consistent with the pilot that I'm working on with MTC and the Nature Conservancy. So the advanced mitigation program that we're talking about would do an upfront assessment through some modeling of the impacts that would be created by the investments that are described in the program here, primarily the capital projects. And it's been done elsewhere. You model the footprint, you have some spatial data about species that may be or biological species that would be affected, and instead of waiting and going through detailed studies and mitigating one project at a time over 25 years, you would do that up front. So it's not necessarily, and actually we talked to the person to my left about this, this is not going out and acquiring open space because we think it's the right thing to do. This is to mitigate the estimated impacts of the projects that are described in the program. So, I'm sorry? There's a proposed funding line item for it in the category description, because what other measures have done is they've been able to have what I just described estimated up front, and you just carve it out of the allocations of all the projects and put it in one line item. I'm not sure we're going to be there yet. So then there's the separate section that's the RAMP policy that's in the back, and that's trying to describe that as well. But I think it's, and I appreciate Commissioner Abelson's question, because it's something we've carried for a long time, and I hear it described what sounds to me like it's land acquisition, and ultimately we are acquiring land to mitigate the impacts of projects, but it's for that mitigation purpose and not for other purposes.
So,
should I go down?
Well, I just wanted to add, while we're on talking about the ramp you raised, I said one clarification from SWAT that we would like to see is that to the extent this occurs, that the mitigation occurs reasonably proximate to where the project is. So the I-680 mitigation doesn't occur in East County, and the Byron Highway mitigation doesn't occur in Richmond, for example.
Yes, and that's the ultimate goal of this pilot, which could expand beyond transportation and other impacts. The ideal nirvana that a lot of people see here would be countywide HCP. So yes, you'd want the impacts to be mitigated proximate to where the impacts occur.
Ask again. We have a letter here from WICTAC with 3 issues. So I'm just trying to figure out from Commissioner Abelson how many other policy issues that are being brought up that were not discussed at WICTAC or not part of the WICTAC letter.
I'm not ready to go. I can just get through it faster than I can figure out what that number is actually.
We still have questions on the map?
I just want to comment on, because AMP and RAM shows up in 2 places, and to expand a little further on what Don was saying, we need to be a little clear, and I'd love to buy land and do all those wonderful things. Is that for CEQA? Because we got to be clear. If it's for CEQA, then the rules, those are the impacts. We're talking about something that is a higher level that's not related. So the reason the comment that SWAT, and I've heard from other cities, their belief is that when you talk about mitigation as we know it in land use planning, and according to law, is based on California Environmental Quality Act. That project has an impact, pre-identifying those. It's not written that way. So how do you legally do advanced mitigation, and in fact, you still have an EIR that has to be done, and you still have the CEQA mitigation measures, and how does this tie in? Right now, they don't. This is like a trade-off of, well, you're going to do this. It's good that we do this over here. But to the voters, we need to be honest. Are we saying that that's what we're going to do? Or is this really going to be part of the CEQA process, and we are going to pre-identify what we believe those implications are in a cost to make sure that those funds are adequately set aside, so we know that they get done. And then you'll fully know what the cost is of doing that project.
Is that what your paragraph in your letter is about? Yeah, I mean, I'm...
Okay, so the advanced mitigation does not relieve the project sponsor of any CEQA requirements. So it is, pardon me? It's for, if a project has impacts that are required to be mitigated, you need to do that as you go through your studies, and it's really to get your permitting.
So how do we then say, from a legal basis, a project must, in the state of California, whether it be a transfer station, any project comes up through the CEQA process has these mitigation. So how do we tell the voters, and well, this is an additional mitigation. What's the criteria for it? Who's deciding it? And the East County mitigation? Okay. That's making some of us nervous. In the rest of the county, all the way up to West County, I know who's driving this, and I like the idea, but the fact is, how do we define that and say what it really is? Because this is loose. This is sort of a policy without a really defined policy to it. And I think that that's dangerous. Our taxpayers associations don't like this.
Chair Tatson, may I just offer a few thoughts?
Commissioner Simmons.
I've been involved in a watershed council for about 4 years and had the opportunity, and I'll use that word, to learn a little bit about the subject. And we're really talking, I think, about 2 very different levels of types of mitigation. The Regional Water Quality Control Board and the Department of Fish and Wildlife require mitigation whenever you have an impact on a riparian environment. And one of the aspects of what I think is a traditional ramp is one that actually does try to develop watershed habitat mitigation projects that can be looked at not on a postage stamp basis when the individual project comes in, like Faria Ranch came in from San Ramon, but you can develop a watershed plan, and then when the mitigation that is pre-approved by Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and then when the project comes in for which mitigation is required, the mitigation part has been pre-approved, and so that the intent is that saves a lot of time. The second level is really what the staff is proposing here, and what is similar to what Sandag did, which is you're talking about a land-based system where your objective is to buy land to preserve that land as a mitigation for other activities, but it's not something that's typically required by, say, the Regional Water Quality Control Board. That would be if this board adopts, for example, I think Brentwood has a 1/2 for 1 egg preservation requirement, or a 1-for-1. If this board adopts it, that would be this board's policy with regard to that type of activity. So there's really two parts of, from my standpoint, of a ramp. And last week's packet, I think, had my letter in it expressing similar thoughts to what Leslie Hunt expressed tonight. If you talk to the watershed groups, and this effort right now by staff has not reached out to the watershed groups at all, they would not support a countywide ACP because these things literally need to be looked at on a watershed basis. And some of the watersheds, like the Walnut Creek watershed, are quite large. Others, like Pinole Creek, are quite small, and they're very different in their requirements and the nature of the mitigation that is needed. And so there needs to be some flexibility here, but from I think that's enough by way of explanation for now. And I'm not speaking, obviously, as a bus transit operator rep, but I'd be glad to answer questions.
So, yeah, I didn't have a question with that. I totally agree with that. That's not the policy issue. The policy issue is it's not written in there as to what this is. It needs to be defined. How does it relate to transportation? What are the specifics in there? That's the policy decision. I understand what the ramp is. I don't have an issue with it, but that's not written that way. It does not say that, and there's no way a person sitting who's never been here, a reasonably prudent person who's not listened to any discussion, can come to that conclusion by reading that. So we need a fresh look at it, and if the policy is we're going to do advanced mitigation as it relates to transportation impacts, then we need to say that. It doesn't say that. And I think all of what you said is exactly the mechanics of how that's done. The why is fine.
So as policy direction, are people comfortable with Commissioner Arnrich's suggestion?
Sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
But one point of clarification, if I might. Is that in, if you will, adopting the language of the letter that's in here, the language on page 4 of the SWAT letter, or is it separate and apart from that? Because there's...
It's a little, I'm saying a little higher level, a real policy level that's written really well, and everybody knows what we're doing. So we don't have a regionalism argument, and that we can say, hey, it was for this, that's it, how it relates, and here's the policy. This is, it's just very loose.
Yeah, no, and
I see what SWAT was commenting on. I'm just trying to go a little further than that.
And the reason I was asking is the clarification is useful because some of the language in the SWAT letter is a little... I think becomes challenging in the implementation phase, given the language. But since we're not talking about that, we're just talking about what he said. I'm fine. We'll come back to the language.
All right.
Should I go on?
If you have others.
Okay, yeah. If you look at the end of 12, which is the bus one, the last paragraph, which is I think one sentence, sort of is a transition to the next item, which is transportation for seniors and persons with disabilities. And it says that the recipients of funding in the bus category have to participate in the development of the Accessible Transportation Services Strategy Plan. So what I'm wondering about is, take, for example, Dave Hudson, you were talking about a certain type of commuter service. So would that mean that that operator that would provide that service would participate in the development of that plan? I think to me that's what that's saying. But what my question is what is the responsibility then of providing accessible transportation that is the companion to that fixed route service provided by that commuter shuttle? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Well, I think the first part is correct. This was language that was put in that came out of the county's letter, or paraphrased county's letter, and probably does need to be reviewed with the more recent wording or wording that was added subsequent to our initial draft about non-rail providers or non-traditional other non-rail is what we're calling it now. So I don't know if the intent was that that would apply to all recipients. It was originally intended that this would apply to the transit operators, the traditional transit operators.
Can I say, the wording says they have to participate in the development of the plan. It doesn't say they have to participate in the delivery of service.
Well, I'm asking the question, I'm asking that question, though, is do they? Because, for example, if they provide commuter service, but it's not, I don't even know if this is illegal to do it, but if it's commuter service, but it's not accessible, I mean, does it have to be? It may, the ADA may already said it has to be.
It may. All I'm suggesting is that I think the wording as it is acceptable because they can be contacted to participate in plan development. It doesn't suggest that they necessarily have a role in service provision.
What does that mean? Does it mean they come and they sit in a room and make comments? Does it mean they vote? And I don't really mean to pick on that as one example, but who develops this plan, who gives comment, and who actually approves the plan in its development? That's what I was wondering.
Well, it looks like under the next category, essentially the authority is responsible for the plan since nobody else is designated. And it's our overall expenditure plan.
So it would be the authority and not any of the operators?
Well, obviously, we would consult with the operators.
Pardon?
The
Yeah,
authority
no,
would consult with the
exactly.
operators.
Okay, that was my, okay, so that answers that. The next thing is that it.
I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt again, and I'm sorry to be rude, but Commissioner Abelson, I'm understanding that these are personal issues of yours, and they are not WIC tax comments. So are we going to go through every issue that you have personally and get a policy direction? That's not what we're supposed to be doing here tonight.
I'm sorry you think that, but.
I've confirmed it with your colleague on WICTAC. You did not discuss these things at WICTAC, so why are you bringing them up? You should bring them up under your role as an El Cerrito City Council person when this comes to the city, not here tonight at an authority meeting.
Okay, I'd like to
How many more issues do you have? I'm serious. How many more issues do you have?
Well, yeah, this is probably not the right way.
I'm sorry, but this is very frustrating to the rest of us who have looked at these things and agreed that it was the RTPCs who were to be commenting tonight. And Commissioner Abelson assured us earlier that that is what she was going to be doing, and that is not what she is doing tonight. And we have members in the audience who are here who may want to comment also further, and I just think it's not fair to the rest of us. And so I'm asking personally, Janet, how many more issues do you have to go through?
Not very many.
You said that last time.
Okay, but I didn't get to comment more than a couple sentences. The one of the things I noticed in looking through the document was that some of the words it would be helpful if they were defined, like transit, for example. If it were to the more of an
So can I suggest that when this is going to go back out for a rewrite, we said that earlier, let's let that happen then. What I would like to do is maybe move on to some of the other commissioners. We can come back to you. But let me see if other commissioners have some general policy comments. Commissioner Hudson, are there comments you want to make that are in addition to those in the SWAT letter? No. Thank you. Are there any comments from the county? Commissioner McCoy.
I just have one question of clarification.
Okay.
Under the maintenance of effort, which is category 9 on page 28 of 31, it says the average of the last 3 full fiscal years of expenditure, so on and so forth, will be the basis of the MOE. Cities who have, for example, saved up money to do a big street project, under that scenario are going to be in some ways penalized. And I'm sure that wasn't the intent of this, so I'm wondering if some clarification on how that language could be modified to allow for
I think Commissioner McCoy's comment is a good one. Lafayette happens to fall in the same category. And so I don't think it's the intent. So we don't have to work out a solution now, but there is an issue that cities will in some cases save money over a period of years to do a big project, and that affects their,
They're 3 years.
right, their 3-year average.
Yep.
Thank you. Anything else? Commissioner Hudson, we're back.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was kind of trying to stay on one, but there was a comment in SWAT, and I think we need to look at it as far as policy on number 7, which was the improved traffic flow, and just the highlighted area projects. This is on staff report 1-112, the actual TEP, and we had commented projects funded from this category must be physically or immediately contiguous to 680 or 24, and I thought we were looking at, throughout the language we've had, the transit villages within a half mile. We even thought maybe within a mile. I know there's some concern that we would take the money and go, 15 miles away or something. I don't think that's it, but I would hate to do something like this and preclude the intermodal within a business park in San Ramon. So, I think we suggested a mile at the SWAT and would like to see how others feel. I think we need to be a little bit more flexible than just contiguous
And
to
that
680.
is reflected in the SWAT letter.
Okay. Yes, it is. But it isn't on the, it isn't.
No, because the letter came after this was written, so, all right.
Mr. Chair, I would ask a question, because our consultants asked this, or at least they commented on it, and none of us in our RTPCs, and that is the length of this. And I noticed that when Commissioner McCoy was talking, maybe that's a question that, are we taking that back to our RTPCs? Is that the request of the consultants, or do we want to give policy direction on that tonight?
We can give policy direction if we wish.
I'd like to hear from my fellow commissioners. What I heard Mr. Gray say was that if it's 5 years longer, that is a bigger pot. And maybe we could hear a little, maybe we don't need to talk about, but I just saw that in flipping through that seems to me a major policy issue.
This is the maintenance of effort.
It was on page, I thought she said 28 or 31.
This is the maintenance of effort issue.
It's the duration.
Right,
it's not the maintenance of effort, it's the duration of the measure.
Oh, okay. I see, okay. All right.
Chair, may I comment on this, and Bill may want to add as well. I think the context of what Bill was saying is that, he was talking about some of if you just look at the tables, would appear to be unbalanced between some of the regions and different categories. And of course, major streets is the one that sticks out the most. If we went to a longer period, there'd be additional funds available if we wanted to do that kind of a balance. So I think that was, and Bill, you might want to add to it, I think that was really the context of what we could look at. If you want us to come back and say, if we did 30 years, I don't want to contradict Commissioner Arnerich's direction, we could say, here's a scenario that could be more balanced.
I guess I would just add to, today, we're not recommending anything more than the 25-year measure. Your board gave pretty clear direction in terms of the development of this draft. All I was trying to say, as Ross indicated, as we work over the next month to try to resolve all what in some cases are conflicting requests for money and priorities, that may be a recommendation of ours, but today it is not. And so
right.
I don't think we need any input on that today.
And that's great. I think it's important to have that on the record.
Maybe this direction.
Commissioner Arnerich.
Thank you. I think a couple of questions or a couple of points that I think we should be careful, since these are supposed to be policies. Sometimes we say, and as much as I think we've heard strongly from our bike community, there's a statement, it's in the SWAT's letter, I just want to highlight it. It says, shall be separated bike lanes. We ought to use phrases such as, right? Because the future we might be doing something completely different. We want to be careful saying it's that, because what it really said is the only thing you can do is do a separated bike lane. And in some communities, that makes a lot of sense. Other ones that have little tiny narrow country roads, you're going to have to come up with a different solution. So a caution. And there was another one in the SWAT letter that talked about TOD and BART, and or BART, or such as BART, because there are TODs in the San Ramon Valley. We don't have BART. And by the way, we've been paying a lot more than Byron has for 40, 50 years. But we don't have BART. But we do have other types of things and things that they're looking at. So it ought to say such as, and the reason why it gives the flexibility to do that. Then the other real high level, I handed our description of when we talk about BART, and I couldn't, just two people, reasonable people. One had 2 master's degrees, the other one had 1. And they had no idea what that meant, and they're a voter. They had no idea what we were talking about. It conflicts itself. And they said, are we buying cars? Oh, no, wait a minute. There's $100 million. So there's $100 million, the way they read it, that's in there that says for facilities. And there's $200 million that's going to go for a whole long list of other things. So if we're going to write something, and we still have to have this whole BART question issue as we move further forward, about how this is going to play, how it's going to affect our, or what impacts it will have if it's in or out of ours, and to know with confidence about our other standards that we have in there. So the policy issue is it going to be, is the proposal, because it's all that's really been articulated, that the $300 million that was proposed when this category was revised, that it would go to help buy rail cars. And the argument was that in capital bond measures, you can't buy rolling stock. Okay, ours is not ours is not that. So somehow we can include it in ours. BART can't include it in theirs, based on the process they're going through. Then we ought to say that, because now it has language in there that says, or maybe control systems. Well, by the way, they can do control systems in theirs. That is, we ought to be absolutely, this is a contract that we're going to recommend, you and all of us are going to recommend to voters, and we say, we're guaranteeing that's what it's going for. This is such loose language, and I know it's been evolving, but we need to be laser clear on this. And then there's some talk that, well, the original $124.5 million that the RTCPs came up with projects around the BART centers that would improve access, has disappeared. But that's kind of the pull-up for the $100 million because that got carved back. We need to be really clear. So we can't do both. And BART has, to the knowledge that I have now, they don't have the ability to guarantee, well, if you do the 300 for us, we'll come back and do those parts. They cannot do that. That's a contingency on something else. So we ought to try to wrestle with that with a policy. Do we want to say this is going to that for the $300 million, 100% in, and we ignore the other $100 million that we were talking about? And if it doesn't, then the first 100, if that 300 does not get to BART because our partners can't stand up, because that's our funding requirement, that the first $100 million of that will go back to those planned projects, and the rest of it is going to go X, Y, Z. And we ought to be real clear about that, because that language, I think, from a policy level is so vague, and if we think it's important, we'll lose on that face value, because I haven't found anybody. I'm sure we can keep going out, but you have to ask a person who doesn't know anything about this and knows the discussion.
Okay. Good point. I think maybe a consideration is we've said that what we're interested in are cars and to some extent the train control system. Yeah, we put that second in the description. So perhaps the approach is, put first in the description what it is we want to fund. And then say that that's conditional upon BART providing $100 million in various other improvements and conditional upon the other agencies participating. And then at BART, and then we can have wording elsewhere as to what happens if those conditions are not met.
Just be clear.
Right. Commissioner McCoy?
Along those lines, it says, a regional approach that includes binding funding commitments from both Alameda and San Francisco counties. But it doesn't say what the level of that commitment is. So are we putting in 300 and they're putting in 100, or should there be specific language?
It has to be worked out.
Yes.
It's equal, plus there's an MTC contribution as well.
Well, then it needs to say that it needs to be
put all
equal.
those
That
in.
language is not there.
Right. I agree. Okay. Commissioner Pierce.
Really? Well, unless I'm contradicted by my colleague, I think TransPAC was fine with the policy issues. We did some reshuffling of the actual dollars, but policy issues, based on tonight's conversation, we're happy.
Okay. And I will echo Commissioner Hudson that for SWAT, recognizing the things that are mentioned in our letters, which deal mainly with policy issues, because we had so little money left, we did no reshuffling, that we've submitted all our comments. I have separately submitted comments directly to Ross, which are primarily minor wording issues, which will be irrelevant as they rewrite it anyway. Commissioner Arnrich, other items?
No,
Okay.
not at this point. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I think I appreciate. I would like to do this because you had the opportunity to write. I would still like to hear Commissioner Abelson's because.
Well, we'll come back.
Yeah, because on our agenda, to be fair, her comments are as valid. I'm making city comments because I represent all the cities. I'm making my comments. I'm pretty smart. So no, we're not. It's because he asked us to do that first. But in fact, we can do this, and I think we do. Because if we hold up somebody from talking, it'd be like cutting a speaker off. Janet, I don't want to argue about this. I'm just
not arguing. I don't have a problem. Just be honest about
you're
what it is
interrupting. You're doing what we're talking. So we just need to have that patience. And I would personally like to hear it. If everybody else disagrees, that's fine. But I'd like to hear what her comments are.
I was going to go back to Commissioner Abelson. So.
I would like to make one comment. I have been hearing from audience members that all we need is for, and I'm happy to listen to Commissioner Abelson. I want her to be honest about what she's talking about. She is not representing WCTAC. She's representing her personal viewpoint. And I don't agree with that, but I'm happy to hear her.
Okay. Commissioner Durant, do you have any other comments on the policies?
Not at this time.
Thank you. I think Commissioner Taylor, you've already commented. Commissioner Keller.
Comment again. No.
Sure.
Right. Commissioner Keller.
Sure glad to be called on at this point in the conversation. To the point that Commissioner McCoy was making, that it doesn't address the equality between the two other counties, I think that clarification is more than appropriate, because it's certainly Bart's intent that if CCTA provides funding for 103 cars, whatever that number is going to be, that will be matched by San Francisco and Alameda County. So I think finding the right language to put in there certainly is not anything that we would disagree with, because that is our intent, and I appreciate you identifying that, because I think the voters need to know that's the kind of security we want to be able to give the voters, that if they step up in Contra Costa County, take that action, that we are going to insist upon the same. We have the BART board has unanimously adopted a resolution that asks that each of the three counties find a funding source for 103 cars. So what you propose is very consistent with what our intent is. So I appreciate those comments. To Commissioner Arnrich, I think we've said in there that BART agrees to fund a minimum of $100 million in authority identified improvements. So if this goes, we've indicated that we will find the money to do that. We've made that commitment, and we intend to follow through with that commitment if this is passed. We have a variety of different sources of funding. We didn't want to identify a particular source because an agency like BART has the opportunity to get a number of different grants from a number of different places. So if we bind it with one source of funding, it may eliminate the possibility of getting it funded. So we are on record as saying that we will support the $100 million in improvements that were proposed by your RTPCs through our bond measure if it passes. And so we're committed to doing that. If there's some language you need to strengthen that, I don't have any opposition to that, and I'm sure we could find a way at BART to try to meet that need to ensure that that's what our intent is. And I would welcome ideas and suggestions about how we can do that. But it's certainly our intent that if this goes forward and the bond measure passes, that we will find a way to fund the $100 million in improvements that have been identified and brought to our attention. We think they're legitimate, and we want to go forward with them. We want to be responsive to the various regions. And to the issue of advanced train control, if we do the cars, there's not going to be any money for the advanced train control. There won't be any money in that category. We just want to be sure that if we do find a way to put all the cars in acquire all the cars that are necessary, they don't do us as much good as they could potentially do if we can run trains closer together. That way we can enhance service and capacity, and the only way we can safely do that is by identifying and building a new train control. So we just put that language in there because I think the voters understand, BART riders certainly understand, that cars and train control are two of the most essential components to improve capacity and enhance our ability to provide reliable service. So if there's some language that we can work on together to make that clearer to people that you all represent, we're certainly happy to do that. This is not the final language. We're willing to work with Ross and your staff to come up with language that satisfies your concerns, and I think we have to be partners if we want to be successful.
Well, I think we've agreed that we need to flip the order of this to put the cars first and foremost. And then perhaps as part of that, we can then come, if there's other language.
Could I make one quick comment on that? This started, first of all, the first draft of this came before we had the request for BART cars.
Right.
So, and it was written around the poll results and our experience with BART in prior measures. So if you read the first half of that description, the promise to the voters is we're going to deal with all of these various things related to BART capacity, BART access, on and off-site parking, all the things that they talked about in the poll and the focus groups. The second half empowers you as an authority after a finding that these measures can increase the capacity for the residents of Contra Costa County, that you then can work a deal with BART on BART cars. And so it's worded that way on purpose. So Plan A is to do what you've promised the voters. Plan B is to allow you the discretion to work with BART under a couple of very specific conditions. First and foremost is that they still you deliver to your voters, using BART money instead of your money, some improvements to the stations, and then that agreement within the region. So I feel pretty strongly, based on this, that if we flip the order and then have some convoluted explanation about how we're going to redistribute the money if it doesn't happen, we're telling the voters that we want $300 million of money into the BART system. That was important. It was off the charts in a poll, if you remember. We have to make this one of the marquee projects, and if it's convoluted and it's going to get reworded by the wordsmith people in our communications group and others, but the legislative intent is here, that do improvements to the BART system plan, access to and from the stations, and we expanded it to include things like last mile shuttles and things like that historically we haven't done. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to look at this, but I want to emphasize kind of the background and why we're at the point we're at. I think this feels comfortable. The $100 million, it was comfortable to the BART staff. They've advised us that. The general wording has been wordsmithed, but it's really important to focus in on what we're promising the voters, which is improve access into and out of BART capacity. But the biggest thing that will help, and I think the BART director pointed it out, is increasing the capacity, because the BART trains are just packed these days. If we can get more capacity, then it's a good investment for your board to make, and we want to give you the ability to do that. That's what this is intended to do.
Commissioner Hudson and Commissioner Durant and Commissioner Argerich.
There was one other thing that came up at SWAT, and that was the under 2, the complete streets or the major streets. And for clarification, when staff is getting this letter from the working group, I wish they'd consider this or ask for clarity. The 20% demonstration project, and I don't want to say a requirement, but strongly pursue separate bike paths or identified bike lanes. Some thought that meant taking a street like Bollinger and you take a lane off of Bollinger and, do you just stripe it, or do you have, a wall to separate or something like that? I didn't see it that way. I see something like the Iron Horse Trail where you're doing an overpass over an 8-lane road and it's the bike or pedestrian usage, and maybe even going a little bit larger. So when it comes in next week, if there's something in that about that, would you kind of get clarification along the lines of, let's be clear about our policy?
So it's right here. That's why I had my light on before we dismissed the SWAT letter. there's on page 2, there's a suggestion for a strike through of a sentence about that point with a separated bike lane, and I thought we heard pretty clearly last week that that was something that we wanted in the pilot. So I think there's two questions. One is in this version we reduced the funding to 30 to 20%, and that basically is 20% over 5 years. It's 20% over 25 years. It's 5 equal increments of 20%. If we want to front load it, we maybe need to go back to 30%. But then the other point is, I thought we heard direction that these demonstration early action pilots should have a separated bike lane. This says strongly pursue. I think last week I heard shall.
Or such as.
Well, no, that's not what we heard last week.
No, others are suggesting such as.
So we're looking for direction on that one.
Let me clarify what my question is, Ross, then. Is a separated bike lane a project that takes a road, you might even take a lane off of it, or can it be something like what we've been doing up and down the Iron Horse Trail? You're putting an overpass over a road, you're separated from traffic, whether it's transit or single, whatever, and you have a bike lane and people are going both ways. I mean, do I have to put a line on that, or I don't even think it would be necessary if you're building a bridge and, stay to the right if you're slower. But get some kind of clarification is all I'm saying.
So my interpretation of that would be that's in the trails category. A complete street is typically contiguous with a road that carries cars. Okay. So a separated structure on a dedicated pedestrian bike trail, I would not generally consider that a complete street project. That could be corrected by members of the audience, but I don't think that was the intent.
Okay. So I know Commissioner Durant and Commissioner Arner, you comment on complete streets, or Bart, or you have something new?
Bart was going to be the thing I was commenting on.
Okay, let's go back to Bart before we move back to complete streets, because we hadn't fully resolved that one.
Okay. So a couple of things on Bart. I think the first thing, sort of to try to pull together some of the other comments, I think the first thing is that if we're not doing sort of the all or nothing approach, that what we're really talking about here is that the measure would provide for up to 103 cars, or up to the $300 million for BART cars, essentially on a dollar for dollar basis with what other counties do, and that only after we're clear that the funds aren't going to be spent on BART cars would the dollars be used for other things. If we're talking $300 million and we've been told the 103 cars are going to cost $300 million, then I think that's the only way to achieve that. And so I think that fundamentally we have to be clear about that, right? That's the first step. Second one is I think the issue with the advanced trail controls is the language that was and/or, right? Because a literal reading of that is you don't have to do, or one doesn't have to do BART cars. One could invest all of those funds into the train controls, as opposed to simply saying BART cars and associated advanced train controls or something like that ties the controls to the actual new cars. So I think you could solve part of that problem in that way.
No, Bart, I just wanted to go back. I appreciate what Joel was saying. It was a big lift from a policy point of view to get to $300 million, because we didn't have it in there. And I think the consensus that I saw was, look, BART, because of the bond measure that they're proposing, it can't have rolling stock in there. And everybody kind of saw that. We saw the value proposition in our county that our voters have told us, our residents, our constituents, that they want more capacity in BART and access. So we were willing to give up the access and put $300 million, 100% into BART cars. So if we're going to do that from a policy point of view, that's a big selling point. Now, we could get some feedback, but by the way, it's going to change our opinion of how it went, because we weren't agreeing to do BART projects for $300 million unless it was for BART cars. If BART is going to make, and as Joel reiterated, They're saying, well, their funding would likely come out of this bond issue. I've heard that from your director. Then that's not a commitment. If BART is going to say, because ours may pass and yours may not, to be honest. And so we need a commitment letter from, I think, our collective policymakers here, sitting here, that BART agrees that if we give $300 million based on the other conditions, that we would have that letter, that they will provide $100 million to go towards those project lists that we had to create that access. So I still stick with what we say, and I understand, Bill, what you're talking about. This language is harvested out of our last one. Rewrite it. So it's literal and honest. The Taxpayers Association will not let us get away with this kind of, there's a lot of money to go into a category that we can accomplish everything we want, but let's be a little bit more little. Are we proposing $300 million for cars? If the answer is yes, then say that. If, and the conditions for that are as follows. 2, that there's $100 million that will come from BART that's committed separately to provide the access of those projects they want, and 2, that the other 2 counties will put up $300 million, and MTC will put up the other or $600 million, yeah, whatever that is. Be literal about that, because that's an honest contract. And then secondly, if that doesn't happen, here's what we're going to do. And you can mark it and tell us that, well, we don't think the survey is going to show this. Do a survey today. There's a survey out there right now that shows 80% of the people are going to vote against anything that has the word BART in it in our county. Not in other counties, but our county. So I'm just trying to find a way to be literal, create a nexus between what we're saying and doing. So hear it or not, but I think that's what we need to do.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I can't let that stand on the record that 80% of the people of Contra Costa County are going to vote against BART. I have seen nothing in multiple pollings that we've done that suggests anything close to that. It would be suicidal for BART to go forward with our measure if our polling, which has been done and redone, suggests that 80% of the people of Contra Costa County are going to vote no. That's simply not the fact, as I understand it. So to Director Durant's comment, I just want to be sure that we take a look at the and/or. I mean, I think there are better ways to address that, and I don't know what the solution to that language is, but I would urge staffs from BART and from CCTA to come up with some language that accomplishes what we all think is the appropriate action here. To Newell's comment about some assurances, if I were sitting in your seat, I would say exactly the same thing. So I don't have any quarrel with that. So we need to put together some document that can be agreed upon by this board and the board that I serve on that meets the criteria that you've outlined, because none of what you said is unreasonable to me. We don't. If MTC doesn't come up with their share, we're probably not going to do the cars. If San Francisco and Alameda doesn't come up with their share, we're probably not going to do the cars. So and if we can't convince you that we're willing to step up and put $100 million of our funds in, you're probably not going to want to support this. So those are all reasonable things, Newell. And I think sitting down and finding a document that we can all agree upon that binds the 2 agencies to that pathway forward, I think makes a whole lot of sense to me. And I would support that completely.
All right, so I think we have direction. Commissioner Pierce wanted to make a comment on clarifying the complete streets discussion.
Yeah, but since we talked about the BART thing, I agree with all of you, but I also realize that the way this is worded, we are making promises to the voters, and our initial polling, first couple of polls, first talked about BART improvements, access improvements, getting to BART the way it is today, before we started talking about cars. So I think we need to find a way, and our wizards of writing can figure it out, to say how we do one, and we promise them one thing, that's all the access stuff. But if everybody agrees, we'll do BART cars in exchange for BART doing the access stuff. It'll all get paid for. And so I think the wizards of writing can figure that one out. When we go back to the complete streets stuff, I don't have a problem, frankly, with the way it's written today, because the place all up in the highlighted area, it talks about the 80% of the money, which can be used for things such as, and it talks about all the different ways that can be included. And it says may include but are not limited to. And then a list of kinds of things that can be done with the 80% of the money. Talking about the 20%, it does talk about being aspirational to include kind of state-of-the-art projects. And I don't have a problem having 20% of the money going to 4 kind of state-of-the-art type projects. And I think that's what it's intended to do, to show people how it can be done, be good examples. We're not all going to be able to do that everywhere, but there've got to be 4 places in this county where we can do state-of-the-art projects that include all those really aspirational methods of doing complete streets. So I don't have a problem with the way it reads today.
That's on the complete streets.
I don't have a problem with the wording. I just had a clarification. Did it extend to what I asked, the bridging, and they said no, and that just makes it tougher.
Okay. I guess my sense is the proposal is a demonstration project in each RTPC. It gets on average 5% of the money. There are 20 jurisdictions in the county. Each on average gets 5% of the money. These are in a sense average sized projects. There's probably one in each RTPC that could include a complete street with a separated bicycle lane. And the other 80% have to follow the complete streets guidelines. And some of those will result in separated bicycle lanes and some won't.
Chair?
They just call the demonstrators from Project One that does.
And I just have a simple question.
Yes.
Is there a value to the authority and to the RTPCs to limit it to 4, or would perhaps an individual RTPC like some flexibility to allocate the money to 2 if 2 of its jurisdictions had something that qualified? And so that's just a question about the number 4.
Yeah, it's not necessary because they're typically about 5 or 6 jurisdictions in each RTPC. To do the math, it works out to 20% of the money would go to one jurisdiction.
It's only $40 million.
Yeah. So. Right. Okay. Let's see. So I think we've gone around the table, except we're going to go back to Commissioner Abelson if you have other comments.
I don't. I'm almost afraid to talk.
Okay.
I think they've been covered.
All right. So what I'm hearing then is that commissioners are ready to turn this back to staff. We will expect comments from EPAC by Friday. And we'll get we'll get a turnaround on this wording. And some comments about the implications of the EPAC comments. It sounds like we will be having our meeting next week with the goal of releasing a document to the city managers and the RTPCs around the end of next week. We will be here next week as our schedule. Mr. Chittenden.
Not to try to prolong the meeting, I did get a sense of a couple of folks that there were some comments that you might want to make to the draft. If you have to the transmittal letter, if you have those, we could revise that and bring it back as well.
Can I suggest you provide those directly to staff and we'll let them work them out? Because we're not going to send it out
By Friday.
by Friday of this week. We're not going to send it out until next week anyway. Commissioner Pierce.
Yeah, just a question. On the calendar, we still have, at this point, at least, scheduled for a planning committee meeting on the 6th. And when we set the schedule up way back when, we said potentially 6:30 for the TEP meeting. Do we want to schedule both for 6 o'clock or 6 and 6:05 so one can follow the other?
Sure.
And that way we don't have any lag time at all?
I think we've been noticing them for 6:10.
Okay.
Okay, I would just suggest the tighter we can frame them, 5 minutes is fine with me.
Okay, so before we all run away, at the end of Ross's presentation, he put up a slide that had about 6 items that were not addressed, and I know Commissioner Arnridge has started to talk about one of those. Do we want to put those back up and see if you want to give direction on any of the others? Sure. Okay, so we can put that slide back up, please. So can I just make a recommendation about number 2, which is the one we started talking about, which is since we are now meeting next week, before you go to the RTPCs, perhaps you could give us at least the Cliff Notes version of what you have in mind at our meeting next week.
All right, please, David, what is the second bullet?
Ross, you want? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, from my perspective, what you're doing is you've given us direction on a number of issues,
right,
and then some clarifications that are necessary. But I think what you're really doing is continuing this discussion as is to this time next week. And I think, listening to what Ron's comment was, they're not going to be ready by Friday, and I don't think you're going to have something for the mail out. But what I think is appropriate is you're going to have this draft, and we're going to work with this group on our reactions, staff and consultant reactions, and be prepared on Wednesday night to provide you with our, well, let them make their presentation, and then we'll react as a staff and make recommendations as to what we think is reasonable or not reasonable to include in the draft. And Ross, we haven't even talked, we're talking this way, but I think we're going to try to be prepared with either errata sheets or something that we can show you on Wednesday night. But having them get their information in by Friday and then us turning it around and being ready to put in a packet recommendations is really not feasible. I think what we need to do is just continue this discussion until next week. As soon as that information is available, we'll make it available. But
right.
But we need a day to react to it and come up with our recommendations in terms of how this might package. So that's my 2 cents about how I see this playing out next week. I think it's feasible. I think we need to do it. I think Eric's I came in here tonight thinking that we needed to get something out on the street, but I'm compelled that it's kind of meaningless if we're going to get a major suggestion. We need to take that into consideration, and that's going to be your policy discussion next week.
Okay.
Is 99% on whether or not to.
So I see people packing up. So going down this list quickly, I think we've dealt as much as we're going to with item 1, which is the fair and equitable regional strategy to assist BART. Potential revisions to the growth management plan. We've heard people's comments or lack thereof. We're going to hear more about I didn't hear anything in there about changing the scope of the Citizens Advisory Committee or the new Oversight Committee, and we're going to at some point get options for how it would be structured. Performance standards is waiting to come back. We did have the memo from BBK regarding the potential TEP to supersede certain provisions of Measure J, speaking solely for SWAT. We agreed that it should, with the exception of the complete streets, recognizing that some aspects of Measure J are already covered by the complete streets law, not the policy. I don't know if other people had comments to the last bullet. Commissioner Mitchoff.
My only question is, and I understand timing issues, but can we actually talk about something that hasn't been part of the packet for the Brown Act? I'm very concerned about that. And I recognize your time frame, but if we're going to talk about some major issues that this coalition is putting together, it has to be noticed appropriately. And at what point do we say it's time? I remember what Commissioner Arnridge said earlier. Tell us what you agree with, tell us what you don't agree with, and then we can have a discussion on that. But that's my concern.
It's a special meeting, so you only need to get this stuff out 24 hours in advance.
No, that's an emergency meeting. That's an emergency meeting, not a special meeting. You need 72 hours. Let Molly.
Thank you, I didn't have the microphone. Special meeting is only 24 hours. Right. And so I guess the question is, I think you probably all want time to actually digest the information, which is separate from the Brown Act issue. So as a policy consideration, if you want the document by Friday so that you have enough time to review it and discuss it appropriately on Wednesday, that to me is the issue.
And I'm going to bow to our council, but a special meeting, at least at the Board of Supervisors, is one that is called in between another meeting. It's not one that's been noticed for 2 or 3 weeks on our calendar. That's
No, you're
just-
incorrect.
Well,
If I could just-
I think she probably knows the Board of Supervisors procedures better than several, at least 9 of us do.
Yeah.
We're told that the Board of Supervisors, a special meeting has to be called between meetings. It's a special meeting as opposed to us just calling this a special meeting.
So under the Brown Act, the regular meetings you have are on the third Wednesday of the month. And so any meeting you call separately would be a special meeting. And so you've been calling these, so when we have the third Wednesday of the month regular meeting, that requires the 72-hour notice.
Okay, and I understand that, but I'm really concerned. This is about transparency
Right.
and dealing with the public, and a meeting that's noticed for next Wednesday, in my mind, should have a 72-hour notice. It's not a 24-hour notice. Whatever the law says, I think our policy should be 72 hours.
So, and I guess I would encourage the members of EPAC who are still here or listening to this on tape that they do have 72 hours. They don't, maybe they can survive without a lot of sleep to get us something. You've heard from a number of members who are concerned about the lack of input. And I haven't seen anyone say, oh, it's okay to wait until the day before.
If I may.
Commissioner Durant.
Yeah. As a matter of, let me just say, decency and respect, let me ask that the folks who are talking about this other proposal, we've been waiting weeks for it. And we've been trying to sort of put ourselves in a position to accommodate it and consider it thoughtfully. It's very hard to do this with even 24 hours notice with the complexity of the issues that are in front of us. And so it simply comes down to this. It seems to me that if we don't have the material, by the weekend so that we have a chance to really think about it, evaluate it, consider alternatives and a whole bunch of other stuff like that, then it doesn't make sense for it to be on the agenda for us to talk about at the next meeting. That's just my view. I'm sort of tired of trying to assimilate, large packets of information on the fly. It's in my way, it is a fundamentally foolish way to do what we're trying to do. And so, just as I said, as a matter of, if nothing else, decency and respect for the human beings who are sitting up here trying to manage multiple priorities, multiple different complex documents, and so on, I think it behooves those folks who want to actually have input and to help actually do something meaningful with this, to get the information here early enough to allow folks to do it. And if that's not possible, then maybe this isn't actually really a serious effort.
Commissioner Mitchell, I wasn't sure whether your comment related to your desire to speak or not speak about the last bullet item.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I just felt that...
No, I understand.
No, I do not.
Do you know what to speak about? Okay. All right, does anyone want to speak about the last item?
That was pretty clear.
Okay, but it still requires a policy. We don't have to, we can. Or we can do it by part.
Let's let the consultants tell us whether they think we need to before we get there. I mean, that's a policy thing we still need to discuss. And depending on how this turns out as they go through stuff, we may or may not need to.
I just had a final comment on that. I just agree with Julia, that's my daughter, Julie, because I call her Jules, that I would appreciate some input on that. Mala gave us the criteria. By the way, the criteria is pretty tight with this. So we have the right to put whatever performance standards we want in this one because the voters vote on it. We also have the right to, and would have a necessity to go back because Measure J still has a long overlap. We have the right to go back based on that criteria and make changes. We have that authority, and it's laid out pretty well what we can do. So I think I would be open, but remember, the 19 cities and probably the county have said pretty clear, there are some areas that are really crucial that we don't change those rules. And I think we've articulated those. So that isn't the catch-all to go back to the beginning on that. So I think in the context of what's been said over the past couple of months, keeping that in mind, then there are some things that will change. And I think I think it's important, and I think we all agree on this, that these end up being identical in terms of the governance. We have one board, one of us, that governance becomes, but we don't want to invalidate the contract with our previous voters and stuff because we're in the beginning of that. And again, Measure C was finishing and these came end to end. They didn't overlap. So a little different.
Okay, well, I think with that, yet another task. Thank you. So we're adjourned for this evening, and we will reconvene at, scheduled for 6:05 or 6:10 next Wednesday. Thank you.